The smell hit first, copper and sweat, thick enough to taste. Ruth Calder's hands were buried wrist-deep in blood when the screaming stopped. Not the mother's screaming. That had ended 20 minutes ago, fading into shallow gasps and then nothing. This was different. This was the silence that followed death, the kind that pressed against your eardrums and made the whole world feel smaller. Ruth pulled her hands back slowly, red dripping from her fingers onto the rough floorboards of the Pritchard cabin. The woman on the bed, Sarah Pritchard, 19 years old, blonde hair now dark with sweat, stared at the ceiling with eyes that would never close on their own again. Her chest had stopped rising. The baby, mercifully, was breathing, squalling in the basket Ruth had prepared hours earlier when she'd first arrived. No, Ruth's voice cracked. She pressed 2 fingers against Sarah's throat, searching for something she knew wasn't there. No, 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 come on, girl. But Sarah Pritchard was gone. Ruth had seen this before. Too many times. Women who should have lived didn't. Women who bled in places you couldn't see, whose bodies gave up trying to hold together what violence had torn apart. She'd suspected it the moment she walked in and saw the bruises. Old ones, yellow-green around Sarah's ribs, fresh purple blooms on her upper arms in the perfect shape of fingerprints. She'd asked. Of course she'd asked. Did he hurt you, Sarah? The girl had looked away, jaw tight. I fell. Women always fell. They fell into door frames and downstairs and against the sharp corners of tables. They fell so often in this God-forsaken territory that Ruth wondered how any of them managed to stay upright at all. But this wasn't about falls. This was about a man's fists and a body that had taken too much damage to survive childbirth. Ruth had tried everything: pressure, ice water, elevation, but you couldn't stitch together what was broken on the inside. Not with the tools she had, not in a cabin 12 miles from town with nothing but lamplight and desperation. The door slammed open. Ruth's head snapped up. Thomas Pritchard filled the doorway, massive shoulders blocking out the weak dawn light behind him. He was a logger, built like the trees he felled, with hands the size of dinner plates and a face that looked carved from granite. He'd been drinking. Ruth could smell it from across the room, whiskey, sharp and sour. His eyes went to the bed, to his wife, to the stillness. What did you do? Ruth stood slowly, carefully, keeping the basket with the crying baby between them. Mr. Pritchard, I'm sorry. I did everything I could, but Sarah, she lost too much blood. There were complications. Complications. He said it like a curse, taking one heavy step forward. You were supposed to save her. I tried. I swear to you, I tried. But she had internal injuries, damage that happened before I got here, and liar. The word hit like a slap. Ruth felt her spine straighten, her jaw clench. She'd been called worse by better men, but something about the way Thomas Pritchard said it, with absolute certainty, like he knew the truth and she was beneath it, made her blood spike hot. I am not a liar, Mr. Pritchard. Your wife had been hurt, badly, for weeks, maybe months. I saw the bruising, You killed her. His voice rose, loud enough to shake the windows. You came into my home and you killed my wife with your witch remedies and your unnatural hands, and now you're going to stand there and blame me? Ruth's hands curled into fists at her sides, still sticky with Sarah's blood. I'm not blaming anyone. I'm telling you what happened. Sarah needed a doctor, a real hospital, but we don't have that here, so she got me. And I did the best I could with what I had. If you want to be angry at the fact that women out here die because there's no help. No medicine, no... Shut your mouth. Thomas crossed the room in 3 strides. Ruth barely had time to step back before he grabbed the front of her dress, hauling her up onto her toes. His breath was hot against her face, reeking of alcohol and rage. My wife is dead because of you. My son, he jerked his head toward the basket, is going to grow up without a mother because you failed, and you're going to pay for that. You hear me? You're going to pay. Ruth tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She'd been threatened before. It came with the work, with being a woman who did things men didn't understand. But this felt different. This felt like the moment before a storm broke, when the air went still and you knew something terrible was coming. Let go of me. You don't give the orders here. Thomas shoved her backward. Ruth stumbled, catching herself against the wall. You're going to stand in front of this town and admit what you did, and then you're going to face justice. Justice? Ruth's voice shook, but not with fear. With fury. You want justice? Then let's talk about what killed Sarah. Let's talk about the bruises on her body, the broken ribs I felt when I examined her, His hand came out of nowhere. The backhand caught her across the cheek, snapping her head to the side and sending bright stars dancing across her vision. Ruth tasted blood, her lips split against her teeth. She didn't cry out. Wouldn't give him that. Thomas leaned in close, his voice dropping to something worse than a shout, a promise. You say one more word about me, and I'll make sure you don't leave this cabin alive. Understand? Ruth understood plenty. She understood that this man had beaten his wife to death slowly, over months, until her body couldn't take anymore. She understood that he was going to blame Ruth for it because that was easier than looking in a mirror. And she understood that in a place like this, in 1884 Montana, where the law was whatever the loudest man said it was, the truth didn't matter half as much as the story. Get out, Thomas said, and don't you dare touch my son. Ruth didn't argue. She grabbed her medical bag from the floor, her hands shaking now, and walked to the door. She paused there, looking back at the baby still crying in his basket, and felt something crack open in her chest. He needs to be fed, she said quietly, every 2 hours. Goat's milk if you can get it, warmed but not hot. Keep him clean and... I said get out. Ruth left. The ride back to town was a blur. Ruth's mare, a sturdy gray named Patience, picked her way down the mountain trail while Ruth sat slumped in the saddle, her face throbbing where Thomas had hit her. The sun was climbing now, turning the sky from gray to pale gold, and the beauty of it felt like an insult. She'd lost Patience before. It was inevitable in this work. The work no one wanted, the work that paid in eggs and flour, and sometimes just gratitude. But this one felt different. This one felt like the beginning of something worse. By the time Ruth reached the outskirts of Stillwater, Montana, population 847 or thereabouts, word had already spread. That was the thing about small towns. News traveled faster than horses, carried on the wind and the wagging tongues of people who had nothing better to do than mind everyone else's business. Ruth rode past the general store and saw Mrs. Hadley pause mid-sweep to stare, past the saloon where 3 men stood on the porch, their conversation dying as she approached, past the church where Reverend Marcus Thorne stood on the steps like a crow in his black coat, his pale eyes tracking her movement with the focus of a predator. She didn't stop, didn't meet their eyes, just kept riding until she reached the small house at the edge of town that she rented for $12 a month. A ridiculous sum, but landlords knew they could charge whatever they wanted when you were a woman alone with no husband to negotiate for you. Ruth dismounted, her legs unsteady, and led Patience to the small shelter out back. She brushed the horse down with hands that still trembled, trying to focus on the familiar motions, the simple task that didn't require thought. It didn't work. Her mind kept circling back to Sarah's face, to the moment the light left her eyes, to the sound of Thomas Pritchard's voice promising consequences. Ruth called her. She turned. Reverend Thorne stood in her yard, his hands clasped in front of him like he was already praying over her grave. He was a tall man, thin as a rail, with the kind of face that looked permanently disappointed. He'd been in Stillwater for 3 years, replacing the previous reverend who'd had the good sense to die quietly of old age. Thorne was younger, sharper, and far more interested in sin than salvation. Reverend, Ruth kept her voice flat, neutral. Can I help you? I think the question, Miss Calder, is whether anyone can help you. He stepped closer, his boots crunching on the dry grass. I've just come from the Pritchard cabin. Thomas is devastated. His wife dead, his child motherless. And he tells me you're to blame. He's grieving. People say things when they grieve. Do they lie when they grieve? Ruth felt her jaw tighten. I don't know what Thomas told you, but Sarah died of complications from childbirth. Internal bleeding, most likely from previous injuries. I did everything I could to save her. Previous injuries. Thorne's eyebrows rose. You're suggesting Thomas hurt his own wife? I'm not suggesting anything. I'm telling you what I saw. Convenient. The woman dies under your care, and you blame the husband. Thorne shook his head slowly, like he was saddened by her depravity. I've heard stories about you, Miss Calder, about your methods, herbs and potions, strange rituals. Some in town say you practice dark arts. I practice medicine, without training, without license, without the blessing of proper society. Thorne's voice dropped, taking on the cadence of a sermon. You are an unmarried woman, Ruth, living alone, performing acts that should be left to trained physicians. Is it any wonder tragedy follows you? Ruth wanted to scream, wanted to grab this sanctimonious bastard by his collar and shake him until his teeth rattled. But she'd learned long ago that showing emotion to men like Thorne was the same as admitting guilt. I've delivered 43 babies in this town, she said quietly. 42 lived. That's a better record than most doctors I've heard of. 42. Thorne smiled, and it was the coldest thing Ruth had ever seen. And how many of those mothers whispered that you unsettled them? How many came to me afterward asking if what you'd done was natural? Natural? Ruth's voice rose despite herself. You want to talk about what's natural? Women dying in childbirth because they're too poor to afford a doctor? That's natural. Bleeding to death in a cabin 12 miles from help? That's natural. You will watch your tone in my presence, Miss Calder. The command in his voice stopped her cold. Thorne wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. He had something more powerful than volume. He had the weight of the church, of respectability, of every person in this town who trusted him more than they'd ever trust her. There's going to be a gathering, Thorne continued, tonight, at the church. The community deserves to hear the truth about what happened to Sarah Pritchard, and you, Ruth, are going to attend. It wasn't a request. And if I don't? Thorne's smile widened. Then I'll have no choice but to assume you're fleeing from justice, and the good people of Stillwater will draw their own conclusions about your guilt. He turned and walked away, his coat billowing behind him like wings. Ruth stood there in her yard, the sun warm on her face and dread cold in her stomach, knowing with absolute certainty that tonight was going to change everything. The church was packed. Ruth arrived just after sunset, her face washed and her dress changed, though she'd left the split lip alone. No point hiding evidence of Thomas Pritchard's temper. She'd considered not coming, had even thought about saddling patients and riding out of Stillwater forever. But running would only confirm what they already suspected, that she was guilty. So she walked through those church doors with her head up and her hands steady, even though every eye in the building turned to watch her enter. They'd arranged the pews in a semicircle, like a trial. Reverend Thorne stood at the center, flanked by 3 men Ruth recognized as the unofficial council of Stillwater, Mayor William Cord, a fat man who owned the lumber mill, Dr. Benjamin Hayes, the town's actual physician who'd never once offered to help Ruth with difficult births, and Sheriff James Porter, a weathered man in his 50s who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Thomas Pritchard sat in the front row, his face a mask of grief. Someone had cleaned him up, dressed him in his Sunday clothes. He looked like a bereaved husband. He looked like a victim. Ruth took a seat in the back. "We can begin," Thorne said, his voice carrying easily through the space. "We're here tonight to discuss a tragedy. Sarah Pritchard, a young wife and new mother, died yesterday morning. The circumstances of her death are troubling." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ruth kept her face blank. "Thomas Pritchard has made a serious accusation," Thorne continued. "He claims that Miss Ruth Calder, acting as a midwife, was responsible for his wife's death through negligence, ignorance, or worse. It's true." Thomas stood, his voice breaking. "She killed Sarah. I don't know if it was incompetence or something darker, but my wife was healthy when Ruth arrived and dead when she left." "That's a lie." The words were out before Ruth could stop them. Every head turned. She stood slowly, her heart pounding. Sarah Pritchard was not healthy. She had extensive bruising, possible internal injuries, and she fell, Thomas interrupted. Sarah was clumsy, always had been. She tripped on the stairs, hit herself on the furniture. That's not what killed her. No, what killed her was months of violence. Enough! Thorne raised his hand. Miss Calder, you're making wild accusations against a grieving man. Do you have proof of these claims? Ruth opened her mouth, closed it. Proof. What proof could she offer? Sarah's bruises were buried with her. The girl had never admitted to being hurt, and even if Ruth described every injury in detail, who would believe her over Thomas? I examined her, Ruth said carefully. I saw what I saw. Convenient, Dr. Hayes spoke up, his voice dripping with disdain. The patient dies, and the midwife blames the husband, a classic deflection. I'm not deflecting, I'm telling the truth. Are you? Thorne stepped forward. Tell me, Miss Calder, where did you receive your medical training? Ruth's stomach dropped. I'm self-taught. I learned from books, from other midwives, from books. Thorne turned to address the crowd. She learned from books, everyone. Not from a university, not from a licensed physician. From books, and I assume trial and error. That's how most midwives learn, yeah, Ruth shot back. There's no school for this, no, and there's the problem. Dr. Hayes stood now, adjusting his spectacles. Midwifery should be left to trained professionals, not unmarried women playing at medicine. Playing? Ruth's voice rose. I've saved more lives in this town than you have, Hayes. Where were you when Martha Gibson went into labor at midnight? When the Anderson twins came breech? When you perform unnatural acts? Thorne cut in. I've heard the stories. Strange preparations, unusual techniques. Some say you mutter words over the mothers, perform rituals. I talked to them, Ruth was shouting now. Couldn't help it. I talked to them to keep them calm, to help them breathe, to make them feel less alone while they're terrified and in pain. That's not ritual, that's basic human decency. Is it decent? Mayor Cord spoke for the first time, his voice oily smooth. For an unmarried woman to be present at such intimate moments? To see and touch things that should be reserved for husbands and doctors? The question hung in the air, ugly and pointed. Ruth felt her face flush hot. I do my job, that's all. Your job, Thorne repeated. Tell me, Miss Calder, do you believe you have a calling to this work? A divine purpose? It was a trap. Ruth saw it clearly. Say yes, and she was claiming to speak for the Almighty, which was blasphemy coming from a woman. Say no, and she was admitting to acting without proper authority. I believe, Ruth said slowly, that women need help during childbirth, and I provide it. Without marriage, without male guidance. Thorne shook his head. This is the root of the problem, brothers and sisters. We have allowed an unmarried woman to operate outside the bounds of proper Christian society, and now we're paying the price in blood. The crowd murmured agreement. Ruth felt the room turning against her, felt the walls closing in. Sarah Pritchard is dead, Thorne continued, building momentum like a preacher hitting his stride. And while Miss Calder claims innocence, the fact remains. Sarah died under her care. We cannot allow this to continue. For the safety of our community, for the protection of our wives and daughters, something must be done. What are you suggesting? Sheriff Porter asked, though he sounded like he already knew. Miss Calder must be removed from her position, permanently. Ruth's blood went cold. You can't do that. I haven't broken any laws. Haven't you? Dr. Hayes pulled a paper from his pocket. According to territorial law, the practice of medicine without a license is illegal. You have no license, Miss Calder. Midwifery isn't medicine. Yes, it is. Hayes looked almost pleased. I've consulted with the Territorial Medical Board. They agree. You've been practicing illegally for 3 years. The room spun. Ruth grabbed the back of the pew in front of her for support. You can't enforce that. Half the women in Montana would die in childbirth if, then they should see proper doctors, Hayes interrupted. Problem solved. The nearest doctor besides you is 40 miles away. Not my concern. Ruth looked around the room, searching for a friendly face. She found none. These were people she'd helped, women whose babies she'd delivered, whose lives she'd saved, and they were all looking away. Some seemed uncomfortable. Most seemed satisfied, like they were watching justice being served. What do you want? Ruth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Thorne smiled. I'm glad you asked. You see, we recognize that simply jailing you would be insufficient. You're a woman alone with no family, no protection. Prison would be too harsh, too final. We're not monsters, Miss Calder. Then what? Marriage. Ruth's brain stuttered. What? Marriage, Thorne repeated. You need a husband, someone to guide you, to correct your wild tendencies, to bring you into proper Christian society. Once you're married, this unfortunate chapter can be closed. I'm not marrying anyone. Ruth's voice shook with anger. You can't force me to. We're not forcing you. Mayor Cord leaned back in his seat. We're offering you a choice. Marriage, or commitment to the territorial asylum in Warm Springs. For your own safety, of course. Unmarried women who practice dark arts often suffer from feminine hysteria. The asylum is equipped to handle such cases. The asylum. Ruth had heard stories about that place. Women went in and rarely came out. Those who did were broken, hollow shells who'd been cured with ice baths and isolation and treatments that sounded more like torture. You're insane, Ruth said flatly. This whole thing is insane. You can't just... We can, Thorne said simply. And we will, unless you agree to marry. Marry who? I don't have any... Ruth stopped. She saw it in their faces, the way they all looked at each other, the shared knowledge of something she didn't yet understand. Who? There's a man, Sheriff Porter said reluctantly. Lives up in the mountains. Name's Elias Vaughn. Ruth knew the name. Everyone knew the name. Elias Vaughn was a legend in Stillwater, and not the good kind. A hermit who'd lived alone for years, who came into town maybe twice a year to trade furs for supplies. People said he was deaf, mute, maybe insane. Children dared each other to go near his cabin. Adults told stories about him, how he'd killed a bear with his bare hands, how he'd survived a winter trapped in a cave, how he was more animal than man. No, Ruth shook her head. Absolutely not. Then you choose the asylum? I choose neither. This is blackmail. It's illegal. It's the law, Dr. Hayes said coldly, as interpreted by the proper authorities. You have 72 hours, Miss Calder. Marry Elias Vaughn, or Sheriff Porter will escort you to Warm Springs. Ruth looked at Porter. The sheriff wouldn't meet her eyes. This isn't justice, Ruth said, her voice breaking. This is punishment for being a woman who wouldn't stay quiet. This, Thorne corrected, is mercy. We're giving you a chance at redemption, at a proper life. You should be grateful. Us. Grateful. Ruth wanted to laugh, wanted to cry, wanted to burn this whole goddamn church to the ground. Instead, she turned and walked out. 72 hours. Ruth spent the first 12 pacing her small house, her mind racing through options that didn't exist. She could run, pack what little she owned, and disappear into the mountains. But winter was coming, and she wouldn't last a month alone. She could fight the order in court, but that would require money she didn't have and a lawyer who'd take her case, which was about as likely as snow in July. She could kill herself. The thought came quietly, settling into her mind like dust. It would be easy. She had laudanum in her medical bag, enough to stop her heart in minutes. No pain, no asylum, no marriage to a stranger who might be worse than Thomas Pritchard ever was. Ruth actually pulled out the bottle, held it up to the lamplight, watched the brown liquid slosh inside. Then she set it down. She hadn't survived this long, survived poverty, the frontier, the constant weight of being a woman in a world that hated women who thought just to give up now. If they wanted her gone, they'd have to work harder than this. On the second day, Ruth saddled Patience and rode out to the mountain. She needed to see him. Elias Vaughn. If she was going to be forced into this, she at least wanted to know what she was facing. Maybe he'd refuse. Maybe he was already married, or dead, or sane enough to say no to this insanity. The ride took most of the day. The trail was rough, barely visible in places, and Ruth had to dismount and lead Patience through sections where the path narrowed to nothing. She passed abandoned mining claims, old cabins that had collapsed under their own weight, the scattered bones of animals that hadn't survived the last winter. The sun was starting to set when she finally saw it, A cabin built into the side of the mountain, smoke rising from a stone chimney. It was small but solid, built by someone who knew what they were doing. Firewood was stacked neatly against one wall. A small garden, mostly gone to seed now, occupied a flat section of land nearby. Ruth dismounted and tied Patience to a tree. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, her mouth dry. She'd come this far. Might as well finish it. She walked to the door and knocked. Nothing. She knocked again, harder. "Mr. Vaughn? My name is Ruth Calder. I need to speak with you." Still nothing. Ruth tried the door. It wasn't locked. She pushed it open slowly, calling out as she entered, "Mr. Vaughn, I'm coming in. I'm not here to hurt you. I just need to talk." The inside of the cabin was dim, lit only by the fire burning in the hearth. Ruth's eyes adjusted slowly, taking in details. It was clean, surprisingly clean for a hermit. A bed in one corner, a table and chair, shelves lined with tools and supplies, everything in its place. Organized. And standing in the far corner watching her with eyes that looked almost black in the shadows was Elias Vaughn. Ruth's breath caught. He was tall, taller than she'd expected, and broad through the shoulders in a way that suggested hard work and harder living. His hair was dark, long enough to touch his collar, and he had a beard that looked like it had been trimmed with a knife and not much care. But it was his face that stopped her. He wasn't old. Couldn't be more than 35, maybe 40. And he wasn't ugly or deformed or any of the things the stories suggested. He looked tired, wary, like a wild animal that had been cornered too many times. "Mr. Vaughn," Ruth said carefully, "I don't know if you can hear me. They say you're deaf, but I'm going to talk anyway, and you can. I don't know, read my lips or something." Elias didn't move, just watched her with those dark eyes, his hands loose at his sides. Ruth took a breath. "The town sent me. Well, not sent exactly. Forced, more like. They want me to marry you. I know that sounds insane, and it is. But apparently it's either marry you or get locked up in an asylum, and She stopped. This was ridiculous. He probably couldn't understand a word she was saying. But then Elias moved. He crossed to the table, picked up a piece of charcoal and a flat piece of wood, and wrote something in clear, precise letters. "Why?" Ruth blinked. "Why do they want me to marry you? Or why am I here?" He pointed to the second part. "Because I need to know if you'll do it. If you'll marry me." Ruth felt her cheeks flush. "Not that I want to marry you. No offense. I don't want to marry anyone, but they're not giving me a choice, and I figured I should at least meet you before we—" She trailed off. Elias was writing again. "What did you do?" "I'm a midwife. Or I was. A woman died during childbirth, and they're blaming me for it. Her husband beat her to death slowly, over months. But I can't prove it, so now I'm the monster." Ruth heard the bitterness in her own voice and tried to rein it in. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't dump this on you. You don't know me, you don't owe me anything." Elias studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he wrote 3 more words. "I'll do it." Ruth's heart stuttered. "What, just like that?" He nodded. "Why?" Elias hesitated, then wrote slowly, like he was choosing each word with care. "They want us gone. Might as well be gone together." It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even kind. But it was honest, and Ruth appreciated that more than she would have appreciated any pretty lie. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay, so we'll do this. We'll get married, and then, what, I live here?" Another nod. "And you're okay with that? With me just moving into your life?" Elias shrugged, then wrote, "You won't bother me. I won't bother you. A business arrangement." "Yes." Ruth felt something loosen in her chest. It wasn't relief exactly, more like resignation. This was happening. She was going to marry a stranger and move to a mountain and leave behind everything she'd built, all because a town full of cowards couldn't handle the truth. "When?" she asked. Elias wrote, "Whenever they want." "Tomorrow, probably. Reverend Thorne will want to do it quickly, before I change my mind." Ruth laughed, and it sounded slightly hysterical even to her own ears. This is insane. You know that, right? This whole thing is absolutely insane. Elias looked at her, and for the first time something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but not quite nothing either. He wrote, "Welcome to Montana." Despite everything, despite the fear and the anger and the exhaustion that sat like stones in her stomach, Ruth smiled. The wedding happened at dawn on the third day, in the Stillwater church with exactly 7 people in attendance: Ruth, Elias, Reverend Thorne, Sheriff Porter, Mayor Cord, Dr. Hayes, and Thomas Pritchard, who stood in the back row like he was watching an execution. Ruth wore the same dress she'd worn to Sarah's deathbed. She hadn't had time to wash it properly, and there were still faint rust-colored stains on the cuffs that might have been blood or might have been dirt. Elias wore what looked like his only clean shirt, a rough cotton thing that had been mended multiple times. Thorne read from the Bible, his voice echoing in the empty space. Ruth barely heard the words. She was too busy watching Elias from the corner of her eye, trying to figure out what he was thinking. His face was blank, expression carefully neutral, but his hands were clenched at his sides, knuckles white. "Do you, Elias Vaughn, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Elias couldn't hear the question. Thorne had to tap him on the shoulder and point to Ruth, and even then, it took a moment before Elias understood. He nodded once, sharp and final. "And do you," Ruth called her, "take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Ruth opened her mouth, closed it. Every instinct screamed at her to say no, to run, to fight. But what was the alternative? The asylum? Dying alone in some cell while men in white coats decided whether her mind was sick enough to warrant treatment? "I do," she said. The words tasted like ash. Thorne pronounced them married. No one clapped. Sheriff Porter handed Ruth a piece of paper, the marriage certificate, signed and witnessed, and that was it. Done. She was Mrs. Elias Vaughn now, wife to a man she'd met once, bound to him by law and desperation. "You have 1 hour to collect your belongings," Thorne said. "Then you'll leave Stillwater. Neither of you are welcome here anymore." Ruth wanted to argue, wanted to point out the hypocrisy of forcing her to marry and then exiling her anyway, but what was the point? They'd won. They'd gotten exactly what they wanted, the troublesome woman gone, the town's reputation intact. She turned to Elias. He was watching her with those dark, unreadable eyes, waiting. "Let's go," Ruth said quietly. They walked out of the church together into the cold morning light, 2 strangers bound by law and nothing else, and Ruth felt the weight of her old life falling away with every step. Ruth's house was exactly as she'd left it. The town council had given her 1 hour to pack, so she moved quickly, gathering what little she owned into 2 bags: clothes, her medical supplies, a few books, the locket that had belonged to her mother. She left the furniture, the dishes, everything that wouldn't fit on a horse. Elias waited outside with Patience, his own horse, a large bay gelding, standing patient beside him. He didn't offer to help, didn't come inside. Just waited, silent and still, like a man who'd learned a long time ago not to intrude. Ruth tied her bags to Patience's saddle and took one last look at the house. 4 years she'd lived here. 4 years of building a life, of helping women, of trying to make a difference in this brutal, unforgiving place. And now it was over, erased, like she'd never been there at all. "Ready?" Elias couldn't hear her, but he seemed to sense the question. He nodded toward the mountain trail. Ruth mounted Patience and followed him out of town. People watched them leave. Ruth saw them from the corners of her eyes. Women peeking through curtains, men standing on porches, children whispering to each other. No one waved. No one said goodbye. They just watched as Ruth Calder, the woman who'd saved their wives and daughters and sisters, rode out of Stillwater forever. The trail was steep and rough, worse than Ruth remembered from her first visit. Elias led the way, his horse picking through rocks and fallen logs with the ease of long practice. Ruth followed, her body moving with Patience's rhythm while her mind drifted. She thought about Sarah Pritchard, about the moment the light had left her eyes. She thought about Thomas standing in the church, watching Ruth get married with satisfaction written all over his face. She thought about the women she'd never help again, the babies she'd never deliver. And she thought about the man riding ahead of her, the stranger who'd agreed to marry her for reasons she didn't understand and probably never would. They rode for hours. The sun climbed, turning the sky from gray to blue, and the air grew thinner and colder as they climbed higher into the mountains. Ruth's legs ached from gripping the saddle, her back sore from the constant adjusting to Patience's gait. But she didn't complain, didn't ask to stop, just kept riding, following Elias deeper into the wilderness. It was late afternoon when they finally reached the cabin. Elias dismounted and began unpacking his horse without ceremony. Ruth did the same, her movements stiff and awkward. She carried her bags inside and set them down near the door, unsure where to put them, unsure what to do next. Elias was building up the fire. Ruth watched him work, the precise, economical movements of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge her presence. It was like she wasn't there. "So," Ruth said finally, because someone had to break the silence, "should we talk about how this is going to work?" Elias glanced up, saw she was speaking, and waited. Ruth tried again, making sure he could see her face. "How is this going to work? Living together, I mean." He stood and crossed to the table, picking up his charcoal and board. "You take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire." "I can't take your bed. This is your house." "Not anymore. Yours too now." The words should have felt generous. They just felt heavy. "Fine," Ruth said. "What about food? Chores? Do we split them or—" "I hunt. You cook." Ruth bristled. "I'm not your housekeeper." Elias wrote faster, the charcoal scratching against the wood. "I didn't say you were. I'm saying I can't cook. If you want to eat something besides burned meat, you'll cook. If you'd rather hunt, I'll cook." It was practical, logical. Ruth couldn't argue with it. "Okay," she said, "I'll cook. What else?" "Nothing else. We stay out of each other's way." "That's it? That's your whole plan for marriage?" Elias looked at her, and for the first time Ruth saw something in his eyes that might have been amusement. He wrote, "Did you have a better one?" Ruth opened her mouth, closed it. No. She didn't have a better plan. She didn't have any plan at all beyond surviving this, getting through each day until— what? Until she figured out a way back to her old life? Until she accepted that this was her life now? "No," she admitted. "I don't." "Then we agree." Elias turned back to the fire, and just like that, the conversation was over. Ruth stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the day settling into her bones. She was married. She lived in a cabin on a mountain. Her old life was gone, and the only person she had to talk to couldn't even hear her voice. She should have felt devastated, should have felt like her life was over. Instead, she felt something else, something unexpected. Relief. Because for the first time in 72 hours, no one was watching her. No one was judging her. No one was waiting for her to fail so they could say, "I told you so." She was alone with a stranger who didn't care about her reputation or her past or what people said she'd done. Ruth walked to the small window and looked out at the mountains stretching endlessly in every direction, wild and indifferent and free. Maybe this wasn't the end after all. Maybe it was something else entirely. The first night, Ruth didn't sleep. She lay in Elias's bed, her bed now, technically, staring at the rough-hewn ceiling beams while the fire crackled and popped across the room. Elias had made good on his word, rolling out a bedroll near the hearth and settling in without complaint. She could hear his breathing, slow and even, the sound of someone who'd learned to fall asleep quickly because staying awake didn't change anything. Ruth envied that. Her own mind wouldn't stop churning, replaying the past 3 days on an endless loop. Sarah's death, Thomas's accusations, the church, the wedding. Every moment felt sharp-edged and wrong, like swallowing broken glass. Around midnight, she gave up on sleep entirely. She slipped out of bed as quietly as she could and moved to the small window. The moon was nearly full, bright enough to cast shadows across the mountainside. Trees swayed in a wind she couldn't hear through the thick walls. Everything looked silver and black, like a painting done in only 2 colors. "Can't sleep either?" Ruth spun around, heart hammering. Elias was sitting up in his bedroll, watching her. In the firelight, his face looked different, softer somehow. Younger. Then Ruth remembered. He couldn't hear her. He was reading her body language, the way she'd startled when she thought he was asleep. She crossed to the table and picked up the charcoal and board he'd left there. Her handwriting was messier than his, letters cramped and uneven. No, too much in my head. Elias stood and added wood to the fire, building it up until the flames cast dancing light across the walls. He wrote, "First night is always hard. You've done this before? Married someone?" "No." He paused, then added, "First night alone is hard too. Everything new is hard." Ruth studied him, this stranger who was technically her husband. He was barefoot, she noticed. His shirt was unlaced at the throat. There was a scar running along his left forearm, old and white, the kind you got from something sharp and unforgiving. "Why did you agree to this?" she wrote. "You didn't have to." Elias was quiet for a long moment, staring at the board like he was trying to decide how much truth to tell. Finally, he wrote, "They would have sent you to the asylum. I've seen what that place does to people." Ruth felt something shift in her chest. How? "My sister. She went there after her husband died. Said she was hearing voices, seeing things. They kept her for 2 years. When she came back, she was different, empty. She died 6 months later. I'm sorry, don't be. Just seemed wrong to let them do that to you when I could stop it. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even particularly kind. But it was honest. And Ruth found herself grateful for that. For the lack of pretense, the absence of false nobility. Elias had married her for practical reasons, maybe even selfish ones, and there was a strange comfort in knowing exactly where she stood. "Thank you," she wrote. "I mean it." Elias shrugged, but his expression softened slightly. He wrote, "You can use the board whenever. I'll leave it on the table." Ruth nodded. They stood there in the firelight for another moment, neither quite sure what to do next. Finally, Elias gestured toward the bed. "Try to sleep. Tomorrow will be long." Ruth wanted to ask why. What made tomorrow different from any other day? But exhaustion was starting to creep in around the edges of her thoughts. She returned to the bed and lay down, pulling the rough wool blanket up to her chin. This time, she slept. The sound of an axe biting into wood woke her. Ruth sat up, disoriented, sunlight streaming through the window in a way that suggested it was well past dawn. She was alone in the cabin. The fire had burned down to embers, and Elias's bedroll was already packed away. Ruth dressed quickly. She'd slept in her chemise, too exhausted to bother with a nightgown, and stepped outside. The morning was cold, frost glittering on the grass, and the air had that crisp quality that meant winter wasn't far off. Elias was behind the cabin, working through a pile of logs with methodical precision. He'd stripped down to just his shirt despite the cold, sleeves rolled up, and Ruth could see the muscles in his shoulders and back working with each swing of the axe. He didn't notice her at first, too focused on his work. Ruth watched him for a moment, surprised by the efficiency of his movements. There was no wasted energy, no unnecessary flourish, just clean, powerful strokes that split each log perfectly down the center. She approached carefully, not wanting to startle him. When she was close enough, she stepped into his line of sight. Elias lowered the axe, breathing hard but not winded. He gestured to the growing pile of split wood with something that might have been pride. Ruth picked up a stick and wrote in the frost-covered ground, "How long have you been up?" He glanced at the sun, calculating. Held up 4 fingers. 4 hours? You've been chopping wood for 4 hours? Elias shrugged. Winter's coming. Need to be ready. Ruth looked at the pile. There had to be enough wood there to last months. "Do you always work like this?" "Nothing else to do." The words hit harder than Ruth expected. She thought about what it must be like. Living alone on a mountain, deaf, cut off from every conversation and connection. No wonder he worked himself to exhaustion. What else was there? "Can I help?" she wrote. Elias looked surprised. He gestured to her dress, raising an eyebrow. "I can change." He considered this, then nodded, handed her the axe. The weight of it surprised Ruth. She'd chopped kindling before, small pieces for cooking fires, but never full logs. She positioned one on the chopping block the way she'd seen Elias do it, raised the axe and brought it down. The blade bounced off, barely making a dent. Elias didn't laugh, but she saw amusement in his eyes. He took the axe back, positioned himself beside her, and demonstrated slowly. The angle of the swing, the point of impact, The way to let the axe's weight do most of the work. Ruth tried again. This time the blade bit deeper, but still didn't split the log. Her arms were already starting to ache. She tried 4 more times before Elias gently took the axe away. He wrote in the frost, "Maybe start with something else." Like what? Cooking? Ruth wanted to be offended, wanted to argue that she was perfectly capable of splitting wood, but her shoulders were screaming and she could barely lift her arms. Fine. She went inside and started going through Elias's supplies. The cabin was better stocked than she'd expected. Dried meat, flour, beans, salt, a small precious container of sugar. There were herbs hanging from the rafters, some she recognized and some she didn't. A jar of honey. Preserved vegetables in brine. Ruth pulled down what she needed and got to work. She'd learned to cook out of necessity, the same way she'd learned everything else, through trial and error and stubborn determination. Her mother had died when Ruth was 12, leaving her alone with a father who drank himself to death within 2 years. After that, it had been orphanages and charity homes and eventually just Ruth, figuring out how to survive in a world that didn't particularly care if she did or not. By the time Elias came back inside, she'd managed to produce something resembling breakfast: cornbread cooked in a cast-iron skillet, beans seasoned with salt pork, coffee boiled thick and strong. Elias stopped in the doorway, staring at the table like he wasn't quite sure what he was seeing. He crossed to the board. "You made food." "That was the deal," Ruth wrote back. "I know, but—" He stopped, erased, started again. "No one's cooked for me in 18 years. The number hit Ruth hard. 18 years. That was how long Elias had been deaf then. How long he'd been alone. "Well," she wrote, "now someone has." They ate in silence, or what passed for silence between them. Ruth could hear the small sounds of the cabin settling, the wind outside, the scrape of Elias's fork against his plate. She wondered what he heard, if there was sound in his head at all, or just endless quiet. The cornbread was slightly burned on the bottom. The beans were too salty. But Elias ate every bite, and when he was done, he wrote, "Thank you." 2 words. But the way he wrote them, careful and deliberate, made them feel like more. The days developed a rhythm. Elias worked outside, chopping wood, hunting, maintaining the cabin and the small outbuildings Ruth hadn't even noticed at first. Ruth worked inside, cooking, cleaning, organizing Elias's chaotic collection of supplies into something resembling order. They communicated through the board, short exchanges that felt awkward at first, but gradually became easier. "Need more water." "I'll get it. Roof is leaking in the corner. I saw. I'll fix it tomorrow." It was practical, transactional, exactly what they'd agreed to. 2 people sharing space but not lives, coexisting but not connecting. But slowly, things started to shift. It began with small observations. Ruth noticed that Elias always placed his tools in exactly the same spots, handles aligned, blades clean. That he ate the same breakfast every morning, dried meat and whatever bread was available, unless Ruth made something different. That he checked the perimeter of the cabin every evening before dark, walking the same path, touching the same trees, like a ritual he couldn't break. And Elias noticed things about her. He started leaving firewood stacked by the stove so she didn't have to carry it, brought back herbs from the forest that she'd mentioned wanting, set aside the best pieces of meat from his hunts because he'd seen her eating the scraps. They didn't talk about it, didn't acknowledge it. But the cabin started to feel less like a prison and more like something else. Not quite a home, but maybe the beginning of one. 3 weeks into their marriage, the first real problem emerged. Ruth woke in the middle of the night to the sound of breaking glass. She bolted upright, heart pounding, and saw Elias thrashing on his bedroll, one arm flung out, his hand bleeding where he'd knocked over the lantern. She was out of bed before she thought about it, crossing to him, grabbing his shoulders. "Elias, Elias, wake up." He couldn't hear her. Of course he couldn't. Ruth shook him harder, and his eyes snapped open, wild, unfocused, looking at her but not seeing her. His hand came up fast, catching her wrist hard enough to bruise. Ruth gasped but didn't pull away. She held still, letting him realize where he was, who she was. Recognition came slowly. Elias's grip loosened, and he let go of her wrist like it had burned him. He scrambled backward, putting distance between them, his chest heaving. Ruth ignored the pain in her wrist and moved carefully to light another lantern. In the new light, she could see blood dripping from Elias's hand, glass scattered across the floor. She gestured to his hand, then to her medical bag. Elias shook his head. Ruth crossed her arms and waited. He stared at her for a long moment, then slowly extended his hand. Ruth worked quickly, picking out the glass shards and cleaning the cuts with whiskey that made Elias's jaw clench but didn't make him pull away. The cuts weren't deep, but there were a lot of them. She wrapped his hand with clean cloth, tying it off securely. When she was done, she picked up the board. Nightmare? Elias looked away, but finally nodded. Happens often? Sometimes. Ruth wanted to ask what he dreamed about, what made him thrash like that, but she could see the shame in his expression and knew better than to push. Instead, she wrote, "Me too, since Sarah died." Elias's eyes came back to her. He reached for the charcoal. "What do you dream? That I'm back in that cabin? That she's dying and I can't stop it? That everyone is watching and blaming me and I can't make them understand?" She paused, then added, "What about you?" Elias hesitated so long Ruth thought he wouldn't answer. Then he wrote slowly, "Fire, screaming, the day I lost my hearing." Ruth's breath caught. What happened? Not tonight. He erased the board quickly, like he regretted saying even that much. "Sorry I woke you." Ruth reached out without thinking and touched his uninjured hand. It was the first time they'd touched deliberately, not by accident or necessity. Elias went very still. "Don't apologize," Ruth wrote with her other hand. "I don't mind. It was true. She didn't." Being woken by his nightmare was better than being alone with her own. They sat there together until the sun started to rise, not talking, not sleeping, just existing in the same space. And Ruth realized that loneliness wasn't about being alone. It was about being unseen. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, someone was actually seeing her. Winter arrived early and hard, sweeping down from the peaks with snow and wind that rattled the cabin walls. Ruth had never experienced a mountain winter before, and the ferocity of it shocked her. The temperature dropped so low that water froze in its bucket overnight. The wind howled like something alive, hungry and angry. Elias had prepared well. The cabin was tight, well insulated, and the massive pile of firewood he'd cut kept them warm. But being trapped inside together, day after day, changed the dynamic between them. Ruth started teaching Elias to read lips. Not intentionally at first, it just happened. She'd forget and speak out loud, and sometimes Elias would understand based on the movement of her mouth. So she started doing it deliberately, saying words slowly while also writing them, helping him connect the shapes to the meanings. It was slow work. Some sounds were impossible to distinguish visually. P and B looked identical, F and V were nearly the same. But Elias was patient, methodical, and Ruth discovered she liked teaching, liked watching understanding dawn in his eyes when he figured out a new word. They practiced during meals, during the long evenings by the fire. Ruth would say something simple, "More coffee?" And Elias would concentrate on her mouth, his brow furrowed, trying to parse the meaning. When he got it right, Ruth would smile. When he didn't, she'd write it down and they'd try again. Slowly, haltingly, they started having conversations that felt almost normal. One night, about 6 weeks into winter, Ruth was reading by the fire. One of the 3 books she'd brought, a medical text she'd read so many times she practically had it memorized. When Elias tapped her shoulder, she looked up. He pointed to the book, then to himself, raising his eyebrows. Ruth blinked. "You want me to read to you?" Elias nodded. "But you can't." Ruth stopped. Right. He couldn't hear her read aloud, but he could watch her face, could maybe pick up some words, could at least share the experience. She shifted on the bench to give him a better view and started reading from where she'd left off, a section on treating infections with poultices and herbal preparations. She read slowly, exaggerating her mouth movements slightly, and watched Elias watch her. He didn't understand most of it, she could tell, but he didn't look away, didn't get bored or frustrated, just watched her lips form words and seemed content with that. When Ruth's voice grew tired, she closed the book. Elias wrote, You really love it. Medicine. Ruth hadn't thought about it in those terms, but she supposed it was true. Yes, I love helping people, solving problems, understanding how bodies work. Why midwifery? Because no one else would do it. The words came fast, bitter. Doctors don't want to waste time on women's problems. Midwives are poor, looked down on. But women need help. They die without it. So I learned. You taught yourself books, observation, a few midwives who were willing to teach me. Mostly mistakes. Elias studied her for a moment, then wrote, "You're brave." Ruth laughed, the sound harsh. "I'm not brave. I'm just stubborn. There's a difference." Is there? She wanted to argue, but looking at Elias, at this man who'd lived alone for 18 years, who'd married a stranger to save her from an asylum, who'd never once complained about the hand life had dealt him, she wasn't sure she could. "Maybe not," she wrote finally. That night Ruth dreamed about Sarah again, but this time, when she woke in the dark, gasping and disoriented, Elias was there, not touching her, not speaking. He couldn't have known she'd woken, but there, sitting up in his bedroll, keeping watch. It helped. More than Ruth would have expected. The incident happened in early December during one of the worst storms yet. The wind had been building for days, and by the third night, it was strong enough to tear shingles off the roof. Ruth woke to the sound of wood splintering and freezing air pouring into the cabin. Elias was already up, pulling on his coat. Ruth grabbed his arm as he headed for the door. "You can't go out there," she said, knowing he couldn't hear but hoping he'd understand from her expression. "It's too dangerous." Elias pulled free and wrote quickly, "Roof won't last until morning. Have to fix it now." Ruth wanted to argue, but she could feel the temperature dropping by the second. He was right. They'd freeze if the roof gave way completely. "I'll help." "No!" Ruth crossed her arms. "Yes!" They stared at each other, locked in a battle of wills. Finally, Elias shook his head and handed her his second heaviest coat. He pointed to his eyes, then to her, then to the door. "Watch me. Stay close." Outside was chaos. The wind hit Ruth like a physical force, nearly knocking her off her feet. Snow stung her face, and she could barely see 3 feet in front of her. Elias grabbed her hand, the first time he'd done that, and pulled her around the side of the cabin to where the ladder was stored. He climbed first, testing each rung, then reached back for Ruth. She followed, her hands so cold she could barely feel the wood. The wind threatened to peel her off the ladder with every step. The roof was a nightmare. Several shingles were already gone, and the ones remaining were lifting with each gust. Elias had brought nails and boards, and he worked with the grim efficiency of someone who knew that hesitation meant death. Ruth held things in place while he hammered, her body blocking the wind as much as she could. Her fingers went numb. Her face felt frozen. But she didn't let go, didn't stop, because Elias needed her, and that was all that mattered. They worked for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 45 minutes. When the last board was secured, Elias grabbed Ruth's hand again and pulled her back toward the ladder. That's when she slipped. Her foot went out from under her on a patch of ice. Ruth felt herself falling backward, the ground impossibly far below, and terror seized her chest. She was going to die. She was going to fall off this roof and break her neck and die in the snow. Elias caught her, his hand locked around her wrist, his other hand grabbing the ladder, and he held her there while Ruth's feet scrambled for purchase. She found the rungs, got her balance back, and Elias didn't let go until she was steady. They made it down the ladder and back inside, both of them shaking from cold and adrenaline. Ruth's teeth were chattering so hard she couldn't speak, couldn't even think. Elias pushed her toward the fire, stripping off her wet coat, wrapping her in blankets. Ruth's hands were blue. Elias rubbed them between his own, trying to force warmth and circulation back. It hurt, felt like needles driving into her skin, but Ruth didn't pull away. When she could finally move her fingers again, she reached for the board. "You saved my life." Elias shook his head. "You saved mine. Couldn't have done it alone. We're even then." He smiled, actually smiled, a real one, and Ruth felt something warm unfold in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. They sat together until dawn, wrapped in blankets, close enough that Ruth could feel the heat from Elias's body. Neither of them slept. Neither of them moved away. and Ruth realized, with a shock that felt like falling, that she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Elias, not of this life, not of the future. She was afraid of how much she'd started to care. Christmas came and went unmarked. Ruth hadn't celebrated in years. There'd been no point when she was alone, and Elias clearly had no interest in it either. But Ruth found herself thinking about it anyway, about the idea of marking time, of acknowledging that days meant something. She started making small changes to the cabin. She rearranged the herbs by type instead of by when Elias had gathered them. She organized his tools, grouping similar items together. She added her own touches, a cloth on the table, her mother's locket hanging from a nail by the bed, her medical texts on a shelf Elias built without being asked. The cabin started to feel lived in, shared. Elias noticed. He started asking her opinion on things, where to set traps, which trees to fell for next year's wood, whether they needed more salt or could make do until spring. Small things. But to Ruth, they felt enormous. One evening in January, Ruth was attempting to mend one of Elias's shirts, a losing battle. The fabric was more whole than cloth, when he tapped her shoulder. She looked up and found him holding something out to her. It was a carving, a small wooden bird, delicate and detailed, with wings spread like it was about to take flight. Ruth took it carefully, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "You made this?" Elias nodded, picked up the board. "For you. Thought you might like it." Ruth's throat tightened. No one had given her a gift in years, not since her mother died. She looked at the bird, at Elias, and felt tears threatening. "It's beautiful," she wrote. "Thank you." Elias looked pleased, but also embarrassed, like he wasn't sure how to handle her reaction. He gestured to the bird, then made a flying motion with his hand. Ruth understood. Freedom. Yes, she set the bird on the small shelf by the bed, positioning it carefully so she could see it when she woke up. Then she turned back to Elias and did something she'd been wanting to do for weeks, but hadn't had the courage for. She took his hand and squeezed it. Just that. A simple touch. A connection. Elias's fingers closed around hers, warm and rough and steady. They sat like that until the fire burned low, hands joined, and Ruth thought that maybe, just maybe, this strange arrangement was becoming something neither of them had planned for, something that felt dangerously close to real. February came in cold and stayed that way. The snow was deep enough now that leaving the cabin meant wading through drifts that came up to Ruth's knees. Elias had fashioned crude snowshoes from bent willow and leather strapping, and he showed Ruth how to use them, his hands guiding her feet into the bindings with a patience that made her chest ache. They were running low on fresh meat. Elias's traps had been less productive lately. The animals had either migrated to lower elevations or were hunkered down waiting for spring. He'd been going out daily, checking lines, resetting snares, coming back empty-handed more often than not. Ruth watched him return one afternoon, his shoulders tight with frustration, and made a decision. "Take me with you tomorrow," she said, making sure he could see her face. Elias looked up from where he was cleaning his rifle, surprised. He reached for the board. "Too dangerous. Too cold. Too cold." "I've survived worse, not like this. If something happens..." Then Ruth wrote something that made Elias stop completely. "I trust you to keep me safe." He stared at the words for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he nodded once, sharp and decisive. They left before dawn. The world was still dark, the stars brilliant and cold overhead, and Ruth's breath came in white clouds that froze on her scarf. Elias moved ahead of her, breaking trail, and Ruth followed in his footsteps, trying to match his rhythm. The forest in winter was a different place. Silent. Though Ruth supposed it was always silent for Elias. The trees were heavy with snow, their branches bent under the weight. Everything looked the same, white and endless. And Ruth marveled that Elias could navigate it at all, let alone find his way to specific trap locations. But he did. They checked 6 traps, found nothing, and Elias's jaw grew tighter with each empty snare. At the 7th, they finally had luck. A rabbit, frozen and stiff. Elias reset the trap with quick, efficient movements, then tucked the rabbit into his pack. They were heading to the 8th location when Elias suddenly stopped. His hand shot out, catching Ruth's arm, pulling her down into a crouch behind a fallen log. Ruth's heart jumped into her throat. She looked at Elias, asking the question with her eyes. He pointed through the trees. Ruth followed his gaze and saw it. A deer, a young buck with small antlers, picking its way through the snow about 40 yards away. It was thin, ribs showing, but it was meat. Enough meat to last them weeks. Elias brought his rifle up slowly, so slowly Ruth barely saw him move. He sighted down the barrel, his breathing even and controlled. Ruth held her breath, not daring to move, not daring to do anything that might spook the animal. The rifle kicked. The sound was enormous, echoing off the mountains, and the deer dropped where it stood. Elias was up and moving before Ruth could react, crossing the distance to the deer in long strides. By the time Ruth caught up, he'd already confirmed the kill, one clean shot through the heart. The deer had died instantly, hadn't suffered. Ruth expected to feel sick. She'd seen death before, plenty of it, but always human death, always in the context of trying to prevent it. This was different. This was intentional, necessary. But looking at the deer, at Elias already pulling out his knife to begin field dressing, Ruth felt something else instead. Gratitude. Respect. This animal would keep them alive through the rest of winter. Its death meant their survival. Elias worked quickly, his movements precise. He'd clearly done this hundreds of times. Ruth watched for a moment, then knelt beside him. "Show me how." He paused, looked at her, checking to make sure she meant it. Ruth nodded. So Elias taught her how to make the first cut without puncturing the organs, how to remove the entrails, careful to keep the meat clean, how to break down the carcass into sections they could carry. It was messy, bloody work, and Ruth's hands were freezing within minutes, but she didn't stop. This was survival. This was the reality of living in the mountains, and she'd be damned if she'd shy away from it. By the time they were done, the sun was fully up and Ruth was exhausted. They cached most of the meat. Elias had built several small storage platforms high in trees specifically for this purpose and took what they could carry back to the cabin. That night, they ate fresh venison steaks cooked in the cast iron skillet, seasoned with salt and wild herbs. It was the best thing Ruth had tasted in months. Elias must have thought so too, because he wrote, "You're learning." Learning what? How to live here. Really live, not just survive. Ruth thought about that while she chewed. He was right. Somewhere between autumn and now, something had shifted. She wasn't just enduring this life anymore, waiting for it to end or change. She was participating in it, choosing it. "Is that good?" she wrote. Elias's response came slowly, like he was choosing his words carefully. "Yes, means you're staying." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them quite wanted to examine. Ruth set down her fork. "Did you think I wouldn't? Thought you might run when spring came. Go back to town or somewhere else, somewhere better." Ruth felt something twist in her chest. "There is nowhere better. Stillwater wanted me gone. The whole territory probably knows my name by now, knows what they said I did." She paused, then added, "Besides, I made a promise. To you. Promises can be broken. Not by me." Elias studied her face for a long moment, and Ruth wondered what he saw there. Whatever it was, it made his expression soften in a way she'd never seen before. He reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. "Good," he wrote with his other hand, "because I don't want you to leave." The admission felt huge, dangerous. Ruth's heart hammered against her ribs. She should pull her hand away, should remind them both that this was supposed to be temporary, transactional, nothing more. Instead, she squeezed his fingers and wrote, "I don't want to leave either." That night, for the first time since their wedding, Elias didn't sleep by the fire. He pulled his bedroll close to the bed. Not in it, not yet, but close enough that Ruth could hear his breathing in the dark, could reach out and touch him if she wanted to. She didn't. But knowing she could was enough. The collapse happened 3 weeks later in the middle of the night. Ruth woke to the sound of Elias thrashing again. Another nightmare, and she was halfway out of bed to wake him when she realized something was different. He wasn't just thrashing, he was convulsing, his whole body rigid, his hands clutching at the side of his head. Ruth dropped to her knees beside him. "Elias! Elias, what's wrong?" He couldn't answer, couldn't hear her. His eyes were squeezed shut, his face twisted in agony, and even in the dim firelight Ruth could see he'd gone pale. She grabbed his shoulders, tried to hold him still, but he was stronger than her and in too much pain to control himself. His elbow caught her in the ribs, hard enough to knock the wind out of her, but Ruth didn't let go. "Stop! Stop fighting me! Let me help!" It took several minutes, but the convulsions finally eased. Elias went limp, breathing hard, sweat soaking through his shirt. Ruth kept her hands on him, afraid he'd start again, afraid he'd hurt himself. When his eyes finally opened, they were unfocused, glassy with pain. Ruth helped him sit up, got him leaning against the wall, and grabbed the board with shaking hands. "What's wrong? What happened?" Elias's hand trembled as he took the charcoal. "Head, pain, bad." "Where?" He pointed to his right ear, the same ear he always tilted away when Ruth spoke to him, the one he sometimes pressed his palm against when he thought she wasn't looking. "How long has this been happening?" "Years. Sometimes. Gets worse." Ruth felt ice settle in her stomach. She'd treated headaches before, migraines that could debilitate people for days. But this seemed different. Worse. And connected to his deafness somehow. "Let me look." "No." Ruth didn't argue. She just moved closer, positioning herself so Elias could see her face, and said very clearly, "Let me look, please." Elias held her gaze for a long moment, and Ruth saw fear there. Real fear, the kind that came from being hurt and not knowing why, from suffering alone because there was no one to help. Finally, he nodded. Ruth built up the fire until the cabin was bright as day, then gathered her medical supplies. She had Elias sit on the bed where the light was best, tilting his head so she could examine his ear. The outer ear looked normal. Ruth checked for inflammation, swelling, anything obvious. Nothing. She asked Elias to open his mouth, checked his throat, felt along his jaw and neck for swollen lymph nodes. All normal. "I need to look inside," she said, holding up her oroscope. A simple tool, just a curved metal piece with a magnifying lens, but better than nothing. Elias tensed but didn't pull away. Ruth inserted the scope carefully, angling it to catch the firelight. The ear canal was clear at first, normal pink tissue, and Ruth was starting to think maybe it was just nerve pain, something she couldn't see or treat when she saw it. Deep in the canal, right up against the eardrum, something moved. Ruth's hand froze. She adjusted the angle, looked again. It was still there. Something pale, segmented, definitely alive. She pulled back slowly, keeping her expression neutral, even though her mind was racing. She picked up the board with hands that wanted to shake. "There's something in your ear." Elias's face went blank. "What do you mean, something?" "A parasite. I think. Living tissue. Moving." Ruth watched the information land, watched Elias process it. His hand came up to his ear, touching it gently, like he was feeling for something he'd never known was there. "How long?" "I don't know. Could be years. Could be. Could be the entire time he'd been deaf. Could be the cause of it." Ruth wrote that part carefully. "It might be why you can't hear. If it's damaged the eardrum or the bones behind it, can you remove it?" The question Ruth had been dreading. She set down the charcoal and looked at Elias, really looked at him. This was dangerous. She had no surgical training, no proper tools, no anesthesia beyond whiskey. If she damaged the eardrum further, he could lose what little hearing might still be salvageable. If she caused an infection, it could spread to his brain. If she slipped, even slightly, she could hurt him in ways that couldn't be fixed. But if she did nothing, the parasite would keep growing, keep causing pain, might eventually kill him. "I can try," Ruth wrote, "but it's dangerous. I could make it worse." Elias read the words, then took the charcoal from her. His response was immediate, certain. "I trust you." 3 words, but they carried the weight of everything that had built between them over the past months, all the small moments, the shared survival, the gradual erosion of walls they'd both built to protect themselves. Ruth nodded. Okay. But not tonight. I need to prepare, sterilize tools, figure out the best approach." Elias understood from her expression. He wrote, "When? Tomorrow night. I need daylight to see what I'm doing, but we'll wait until dark so you're tired. Might help you stay still." The next day was the longest of Ruth's life. She spent it preparing, going through her medical supplies over and over, boiling instruments until she was sure they were clean. She reviewed everything she knew about ear anatomy from her textbooks, sketching diagrams, memorizing the structure. Elias watched her work but didn't interrupt. He chopped wood, checked traps, did all his normal tasks, but Ruth could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept touching his ear like he was trying to feel what she'd seen. They ate dinner in silence, neither of them hungry but going through the motions. Ruth had laid out her instruments on a clean cloth, small forceps, a probe, cotton swabs, a bottle of whiskey for sterilization and pain management. When the sun started to set, Ruth lit every lamp and candle they had. She needed light, as much light as possible. Elias sat on the bed without being asked, tilting his head to give Ruth access to his right ear. Ruth could see his hands clenching into fists, the only sign of his fear. She picked up the board one last time. "This will hurt. I'm sorry. I know. If it's too much, push my hand away. I'll stop. Don't stop. No matter what." Ruth's throat tightened. She set the board aside and positioned herself carefully, one hand steadying Elias's head, the other holding the smallest forceps she had. "Ready?" She knew he couldn't hear, but his eyes were on her face, and he nodded. Ruth inserted the oroscope first, relocating the parasite. It had moved slightly, was now partially wrapped around what looked like the malleus, one of the tiny bones that transmitted sound. Her stomach dropped. This was going to be even harder than she'd thought. She switched to the forceps, guiding them into the ear canal with steady hands. The space was so small, the margin for error non-existent. Ruth's world narrowed to the point of the forceps, the pale shape of the parasite, the delicate pink tissue surrounding it. The forceps touched the parasite. It writhed, and Elias jerked, a harsh sound escaping his throat. Ruth pulled back immediately. I'm sorry, but I have to keep going." She repositioned, tried again. This time she got a grip on the parasite's body, but when she pulled, it held fast, attached to something. Ruth's heart sank. She withdrew the forceps and picked up the probe instead. Very carefully she worked it around the parasite, trying to find where it was anchored. There, attached to the eardrum itself, feeding on tissue and blood. Ruth made a decision. She couldn't pull the parasite free without tearing the eardrum. But she could detach it first. She grabbed the sharpest instrument she had, a small scalpel meant for lancing boils, and dipped it in whiskey. Her hands were steady. They had to be. There was no room for shaking now. The scalpel went in. Ruth felt the exact moment it touched the attachment point, felt the resistance. She applied pressure, gentle but firm, and something gave way. Elias made a sound Ruth had never heard from him before. High, raw, animal. His whole body went rigid. Blood welled up, more than Ruth had expected, and for a terrible moment she thought she'd cut the wrong thing, had damaged something vital. But the parasite was loose now. She could see it moving freely in the canal. Ruth dropped the scalpel and grabbed the forceps again, her movements quick and sure. She got hold of the parasite, something long and segmented, maybe 2 inches when stretched out, and pulled. It came free. Ruth set it aside in a dish and immediately went back with cotton swabs, packing the ear canal to stop the bleeding. Elias was shaking now, his breath coming in harsh gasps, but he hadn't pulled away. Hadn't told her to stop. The bleeding slowed, then stopped. Ruth removed the packing carefully and examined what she could see. The eardrum was torn, but not destroyed. The bones looked intact. There was damage, yes, but possibly not permanent damage. She sat back, her own hand shaking now that it was over. Elias's eyes were closed, his face pale, sweat dampening his hair. Ruth touched his shoulder gently. When he opened his eyes, she wrote, "It's out. You did so well. It's over." Elias looked at the dish where the parasite lay, dead now, and his expression went through several emotions too fast for Ruth to track. Relief, disgust, horror. Something else she couldn't name. Will I hear again? The question Ruth had been dreading. I don't know. The damage is significant, but it might heal. Might not. We'll have to wait. How long? Weeks. Maybe months. Elias nodded slowly, then wrote, "Still better than nothing." Ruth cleaned and bandaged his ear, gave him willow bark tea for the pain, and made him lie down. She expected him to sleep. He had to be exhausted, but his eyes stayed open, staring at the ceiling. Ruth sat beside the bed, not sure what to do, not sure what to say. Finally, she picked up the board. "Talk to me." "About what?" "Anything. Everything. How it happened." Elias was quiet for so long Ruth thought he'd refuse. Then he reached for the charcoal, his movements slow and careful, and began to write. "I was 17. Working in a mine outside Butte. There was an explosion, cave-in, fire. I was trapped for 3 days with 2 other men. We were buried so deep no one could hear us screaming." He paused, erased, continued. "When they finally dug us out, the other men were dead. I was alive, but I couldn't hear anything. Doctors said it was the explosion, damage to my ears, nothing they could do." Ruth's chest ached. 3 days trapped? 3 days in the dark, breathing dust and smoke, listening to the other men die. "When I got out, I couldn't stand being around people anymore, couldn't stand the pity. The way they looked at me like I was broken. So you came here. So I came here." Elias set down the charcoal, his hand trembling slightly. 18 years ago. And I've been alone ever since, until you. Ruth didn't plan what happened next. She just reached out and took his hand, threading her fingers through his. Elias's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't pull away. "You're not broken," Ruth wrote with her free hand. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. I don't feel strong." Strength isn't about not being afraid or not being hurt. It's about surviving anyway, keeping going. "You did that for 18 years. She paused, then added, "And you married a stranger to save her from an asylum. That's pretty damn strong." Elias's mouth quirked, almost a smile. "You're not a stranger anymore." "No, I'm not." They fell asleep like that, Ruth sitting beside the bed with her hand in Elias's, and when she woke in the early morning hours, she found herself lying next to him, his arm around her waist, her head on his shoulder. Ruth knew she should move, should put distance between them before this became something neither of them could take back. Instead, she closed her eyes and let herself stay. The next few weeks were difficult. Elias's ear had to heal, and the process was painful, uncomfortable, and slow. Ruth changed the bandages daily, checked for infection, did everything she could to help. Elias bore it stoically, never complained, but Ruth could see the pain in his eyes, the way he favored the injured side. On the 5th day, Ruth was changing the bandage when Elias grabbed her wrist suddenly, his eyes wide. What's wrong?" He fumbled for the board with his free hand, nearly knocked it off the table, caught it. His handwriting was shaky, rushed. "I heard something." Ruth's heart stopped. "What did you hear?" "Your voice. Faint, like it's coming from very far away." "But I heard it." Ruth felt tears spring to her eyes. She blinked them back, trying to stay professional, trying not to get his hopes up too much. "Can you hear me now?" Elias concentrated, his brow furrowed. He shook his head. "Just that once. Maybe I imagined it." "You didn't imagine it," Ruth wrote firmly. "It means it's healing. It means there's hope." Over the next week, it happened more and more. Elias would suddenly react to a sound. The cabin door closing, wood splitting in the fire, Ruth dropping a pan. Each time, his expression would light up with wonder and confusion, like he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Ruth started speaking to him more, not just writing. She'd talk while she cooked, while she worked, describing what she was doing, telling him stories about her childhood, about the women she'd helped deliver babies, about anything and everything. Sometimes Elias would catch a word. He'd stop her, make her repeat it, watching her mouth form the sounds while straining to hear them. It was slow, frustrating work, but every small success felt like a victory. 3 weeks after the extraction, Elias was outside chopping wood when something made him freeze. Ruth was inside, humming to herself, an old song her mother used to sing. When she looked up and saw Elias standing in the doorway, his face pale, the axe dangling from his hand. "What's wrong?" Ruth crossed to him quickly, checking for injury, for illness, for anything that could explain his expression. Elias's mouth moved. He was trying to speak. After 18 years of silence, He was trying to form words, and nothing was coming out right. It sounded rough, broken, but Ruth heard it. Singing. You were singing. Ruth's breath caught. You heard me singing? Elias nodded, and Ruth saw tears on his face, actual tears sliding down into his beard, and she'd never seen him cry before, hadn't thought he could. I heard you, he said again, his voice stronger this time. Ruth, I heard you. Ruth threw her arms around him without thinking, and Elias caught her, holding her tight, and they stood there in the doorway while he cried and laughed and Ruth did the same, both of them overwhelmed by something that felt impossibly big. When they finally pulled apart, Ruth picked up the board. How much can you hear? Not everything, louder sounds. Your voice when you're close, it's muffled like underwater. But it's there, it'll get better. As the swelling goes down, as your brain relearns how to process sound. Elias touched her face, his palm rough against her cheek. Thank you. I can't. He stopped, frustrated by the inadequacy of words. Ruth understood anyway. She understood perfectly. That night, they didn't bother with separate sleeping arrangements anymore. Elias pulled Ruth into bed with him, wrapped himself around her like he was afraid she'd disappear, and Ruth let him. Let herself be held, be protected, be cared for in a way she hadn't allowed in years. Ruth, Elias whispered, and she felt the vibration of his voice against her back. Are you awake? Yes. I need to tell you something. Ruth turned in his arms so she could see his face. What? Elias looked at her for a long moment, his expression serious. When he spoke, his voice was rough but clear. I married you because they gave me no choice. But I'd choose you now. I'd choose this. Choose us. Ruth felt her heart crack open. Elias, you don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know that this isn't obligation anymore. Not for me. Ruth thought about Stillwater, about the life she'd lost, about everything that had brought her to this moment, and she realized that Elias was right. This had stopped being an obligation somewhere along the way, had become something else entirely. Not for me either, she whispered. Elias kissed her then, gentle and careful, like she was something precious. Ruth kissed him back, and for the first time since Sarah Pritchard died, she felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. Spring arrived slowly, grudgingly, like it wasn't quite sure it wanted to stay. The snow began to melt in patches, revealing brown grass and mud underneath. Ice dripped from the cabin's eaves during the day and refroze at night, creating long icicles that looked like teeth. Ruth watched the world transform from her position at the window, a cup of coffee warming her hands, and felt something shift inside her chest. She'd been on the mountain for nearly 6 months now. Half a year since the wedding, since leaving Stillwater, since everything she'd known had been stripped away and replaced with this strange, hard, beautiful life. And for the first time since Sarah Pritchard died, Ruth felt something close to peace. Elias came up behind her, his footsteps nearly silent despite his size. He'd gotten better at moving quietly, or maybe Ruth had just gotten better at sensing him. His arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. What are you thinking about? His voice still carried that rough quality, like vocal cords that had forgotten how to work properly, but it was getting clearer every day. The hearing in his right ear would never be perfect, Ruth knew that, but it was functional. He could hear her when she spoke directly to him, could pick up louder environmental sounds, could exist in a world that wasn't completely silent anymore. Nothing important, Ruth said. Just watching the snow melt. Liar. Elias pressed a kiss to her temple. You get that look when you're thinking hard about something. What is it? Ruth set down her coffee cup and turned in his arms. 6 months had changed Elias too. He smiled more now, laughed sometimes, touched her freely like he'd been starving for human contact and was finally allowing himself to have it. The hard edges were still there, probably always would be, but they'd softened somehow, become less about keeping the world out and more about protecting what was inside. I was thinking about Stillwater, Ruth admitted, about whether anyone there remembers me, whether they ever think about what they did. Elias's expression darkened. Why would you think about them? Because I can't stop wondering if they were right. The words came out before Ruth could stop them, raw and honest. About me. About Sarah. Maybe I did kill her. Maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was, and they saw something I couldn't. Stop! Elias's hands came up to frame her face, forcing her to look at him. That's not true, and you know it. Do I? Because I've been over it 1,000 times in my head, Elias. Every decision I made that night, every treatment I tried. And I can't find the moment where I failed her, but she still died, so somewhere I must have... She died because her husband beat her, Elias interrupted, his voice sharp. You said it yourself, the bruises, the internal damage. That wasn't your failure, that was his. But I couldn't prove it, couldn't make anyone believe me. And now he's walking around free while I'm exiled on a mountain. You're not exiled, you're here with me. There's a difference. Ruth laughed, but it sounded bitter even to her own ears. Is there? Because some days it feels exactly the same, like I'm being punished for something I didn't do. Elias was quiet for a moment, his thumbs brushing along her cheekbones. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. Do you regret it? Marrying me? Coming here? No. The answer came immediately, instinctively. No, I don't regret you, never you, I just... Ruth struggled to find the words. I hate that they won, that they got to destroy my life and face no consequences. That somewhere in Stillwater, Reverend Thorne is probably preaching about the dangers of unmarried women, and Thomas Pritchard is probably remarried already, and Dr. Hayes is still refusing to help the women who need it most. And I'm here, and none of it matters. It matters to me, Elias said quietly. You saved my life, Ruth. You gave me back something I thought was gone forever. That matters. Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. She blinked them back. That's not enough. It should be enough, and I'm sorry, but it's not. I need to know that Sarah's death meant something, that someone paid for what happened to her. Then we go back. Ruth's breath caught. What? We go back to Stillwater. We make them listen. We find proof of what Thomas did, and we force them to face it. Elias's jaw set in that stubborn line Ruth had learned meant he'd already made up his mind. You're not the same person who left. You're stronger now, harder, and you've got me backing you up this time. Elias, they'll arrest me the second they see me. The marriage was supposed to make me go away. If I come back, then let them try. His voice was steel. I'd like to see Reverend Thorne explain to a territorial judge why he forced a woman into marriage to avoid prosecution for a crime she didn't commit. I'd like to watch him squirm. Ruth stared at him, her heart pounding. The idea was insane, dangerous. They could both end up in jail or worse. But the thought of walking back into Stillwater, of looking Thomas Pritchard in the eye and making him answer for what he'd done. When? Ruth asked. Soon as the pass is clear. Another few weeks, maybe a month. Elias's hand slid down to her shoulders, grounding her. But only if you want to. Only if you're ready. Ruth thought about Sarah Pritchard, about that young woman's eyes going dim while Ruth fought uselessly to save her. Thought about all the other women in Stillwater who might need help, who might be suffering behind closed doors while men like Dr. Hayes turned away, and men like Thorne preached about their proper place. I want to, Ruth said. I need to. Then we will. They spent the next 3 weeks preparing. Elias showed Ruth how to shoot his rifle, how to track, how to move through the forest without making noise. She was a terrible shot at first, couldn't hit a tree from 10 feet away, but Elias was patient, adjusting her stance, teaching her to breathe through the recoil. You're tensing up before you pull the trigger, he said one afternoon, standing behind her with his hands on her shoulders. That's why you're missing. You have to stay loose, trust the weapon. I don't trust weapons, Ruth muttered, squinting down the barrel at the target Elias had set up, a piece of wood with a charcoal circle drawn on it. Then trust yourself. You've got steady hands. I've watched you perform surgery with less light and worse tools than this. Shooting is easy compared to that. Ruth took a breath, let it out slowly, and pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder and the bullet punched through the wood 2 inches left of center. Better, Elias said, and Ruth could hear the smile in his voice. Do it again. By the end of the week, Ruth could hit the target more often than not. She'd never be a sharpshooter, but she could defend herself if needed. That was what mattered. Ruth also started writing down everything she remembered about Sarah's death. Every bruise, every injury, every detail she could recall. She documented the timeline, the symptoms, the way Thomas had reacted. It wasn't proof, not the kind that would stand up in court, but it was something, a record, a testimony. Elias watched her work one evening, the cabin quiet except for the scratch of Ruth's pen on paper. "You think they'll believe you this time?" he asked. "I don't know," Ruth admitted. "Probably not, but I have to try. If I don't, then what was the point of any of this? The point was staying alive. The point was not letting them break you. Maybe, or maybe the point was learning to fight back." The passes opened in late April. The snow finally melted enough to make the trails passable. Ruth and Elias packed supplies for a week-long journey: food, blankets, ammunition, Ruth's medical bag, and her carefully documented notes about Sarah's death. Patience and Elias's gelding were both well-rested and ready for the trip down the mountain. The night before they left, Ruth couldn't sleep. She lay in bed next to Elias, listening to his breathing, trying to quiet the anxiety churning in her gut. What if this was a mistake? What if going back to Stillwater only made things worse? "I can hear you thinking," Elias murmured in the darkness. "Your breath changes when you're worried." Ruth rolled over to face him. "I'm scared." "I know. What if they arrest me? What if they put me in that asylum anyway, and there's nothing you can do to stop them?" Elias's arm tightened around her waist, pulling her closer. "Then I'll break you out. I'll burn the place to the ground if I have to." Ruth wanted to laugh, to tell him that was ridiculous, that he couldn't just assault a territorial institution. But looking at his face in the dim moonlight filtering through the window, she believed him. Elias would absolutely burn down an asylum for her, would probably enjoy it. "You can't solve every problem with violence," Ruth said, but her voice was soft, almost teasing. "Watch me." Elias kissed her forehead, her cheek, her mouth. "I'm not losing you, Ruth. Not to them. Not to anyone." "You won't," Ruth promised. "I'm not going anywhere." They made love slowly, carefully, like they were trying to memorize each other in case something went wrong. Afterward, Ruth fell asleep in Elias's arms and didn't dream at all. The ride down the mountain took 2 days. They had to move slowly, carefully, watching for loose rocks and weak spots in the trail. Elias led the way, his rifle across his saddle, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. Ruth followed, her own rifle within easy reach, her mind running through what she'd say when they reached Stillwater. They camped the first night in a small clearing, building a fire and eating cold venison and hardtack. Elias kept watch while Ruth tried to sleep, but every sound made her jump. A branch breaking, an owl calling, the wind moving through the trees. "Nothing's going to hurt you while I'm here," Elias said quietly, not looking at her but clearly aware of her restlessness. "You can sleep." "I know, I'm just nervous." "About tomorrow?" "About everything." Ruth sat up, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. "What if we get there and nothing's changed? What if Thomas is still free, still hurting people, and we can't do anything about it?" "Then we try anyway, and if that doesn't work, we make other plans." Elias finally looked at her, his expression serious. "But we don't give up. We don't let them win again." Ruth nodded. That was all she could do. Just keep trying, keep fighting, keep refusing to disappear quietly, like they wanted her to. They reached Stillwater just before noon on the second day. The town looked exactly the same dusty streets, same weathered buildings, same people going about their business like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. Ruth had changed. She sat on Patience at the edge of town, looking at the place that had tried to destroy her, and felt nothing but cold determination. "Ready?" Elias asked, his hand resting on his rifle. "Ready." They rode down Main Street side by side, and Ruth watched heads turn, watched people stop mid-conversation to stare. She heard whispers starting, saw fingers pointing, felt the weight of their judgment like a physical thing. But she didn't look away, didn't hide, just kept riding, her back straight, her chin up, until they reached the sheriff's office. Sheriff Porter was outside talking to Mayor Cord, and both men went pale when they saw Ruth. Porter's hand actually moved toward his gun before he seemed to remember himself. "Miss Calder," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Didn't expect to see you back here." "It's Mrs. Vaughn now," Ruth corrected, dismounting. "And I'm here to file a formal complaint about the circumstances of Sarah Pritchard's death." Mayor Cord's face flushed red. "Now you hold on just a minute." "No." Ruth cut him off, her voice sharp. "You had your chance to talk 6 months ago. You had your chance to investigate, to listen, to do your jobs. Instead, you exiled me and let a murderer walk free. So now I'm back, and I'm not leaving until someone actually investigates what happened to Sarah." Sarah died of childbirth complications. Dr. Hayes' voice came from behind them. Ruth turned to see him approaching, his expression smug. "You were there. You failed to save her. That's not murder. That's incompetence." "Really?" Ruth pulled her notes from her saddlebag, held them up. "Because I have a detailed account of every injury Sarah had when I examined her. Broken ribs, extensive bruising, signs of repeated trauma over months. That's not childbirth, Dr. Hayes. That's abuse." "Hearsay. Speculation." Hayes' voice was dismissive. "You can't prove any of that." "Maybe not. But I can ask questions. I can demand an investigation. I can make enough noise that someone with actual authority has to pay attention." Ruth stepped closer to Hayes, close enough to see his pupils dilate. "And I can start telling people about all the women you refused to treat, all the emergencies you turned away because they couldn't pay your fees, all the times you let people suffer because their pain wasn't profitable enough." Hayes' jaw clenched. "You watch your mouth, girl. Or what? You'll exile me again? Force me into another marriage?" Ruth laughed, and it sounded sharp as broken glass. "I'm already married, already gone. You've got no power over me anymore." "That's where you're wrong." Reverend Thorne's voice cut through the growing crowd. Ruth turned to see him approaching, his black coat billowing behind him, his pale eyes fixed on her with something like hatred. "You're a fugitive," Ruth called her. "You violated the terms of your exile by returning to Stillwater. That alone is grounds for arrest." "On what charge?" Elias spoke for the first time, his voice low and dangerous. "She committed no crime. You forced her into marriage under threat of illegal imprisonment. If anyone's broken the law here, Reverend, it's you." Thorne's attention shifted to Elias, and Ruth saw something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe. He hadn't expected Elias to be able to speak, hadn't expected him to defend Ruth. "Elias Vaughn," Thorne said slowly, "I heard you'd regained your hearing. A miracle, some say. Though I suspect witchcraft is more likely." "Suspect whatever you want," Elias said flatly. "Doesn't change the facts. My wife is here to report a crime. You gonna let her do that, or do we need to take this to the territorial judge in Helena?" The threat landed. Ruth saw it in the way Thorne's expression tightened, in the way Mayor Cord and Sheriff Porter exchanged nervous glances. None of them wanted outside scrutiny, wanted to keep their little power structure intact without interference from actual legal authority. "There's nothing to investigate, Thorne said finally. "Thomas Pritchard is a respected member of this community. His wife died tragically, and he's suffered enough without you coming back here to torment him with baseless accusations." "Then let him say that himself." Ruth's voice rang out clear and strong. "Let Thomas come here and look me in the eye and tell everyone what really happened to Sarah. Let him explain the bruises. Let him account for every injury. If he's innocent, it should be easy." "He doesn't have to explain anything to you," Thorne snapped. "No, but he does have to explain it to me." The new voice made everyone turn. A man Ruth didn't recognize was approaching, middle-aged, well-dressed, with the kind of bearing that suggested education and authority. Judge William Morrison, Territorial Circuit Court. "I was passing through on my way to Helena when I heard there was a disturbance. Someone want to tell me what's going on?" Ruth's heart leaped. This was it. This was the chance she'd been hoping for. "Your Honor," she said quickly, before anyone else could speak. "My name is Ruth Vaughn, formerly Ruth Calder. 6 months ago, I was forced to leave Stillwater under threat of commitment to an asylum. The reason given was that I'd supposedly caused the death of Sarah Pritchard through medical negligence. But the truth is that Sarah died from injuries sustained through domestic violence, and I was silenced before I could report it. Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose. That's quite an accusation, Mrs. Vaughn. Do you have evidence? Ruth handed him her notes. A complete medical account of every injury I observed, including details that are consistent with repeated physical abuse, not childbirth complications. The judge read through the pages, his expression growing darker with each line. When he looked up, his gaze swept over Reverend Thorne, Mayor Cord, Dr. Hayes, and Sheriff Porter. And none of you thought this warranted investigation? The woman was hysterical, Thorne said quickly, making wild accusations to deflect from her own failures. We handled it appropriately. By forcing her into marriage and exiling her from town? Morrison's voice was dry. That's your idea of appropriate? She needed male guidance, proper oversight. What she needed was due process under the law, which, from what I'm hearing, she didn't receive. Morrison turned to Sheriff Porter. I'm ordering a formal investigation into Sarah Pritchard's death. You'll exhume the body for examination by a qualified physician, not Dr. Hayes, someone from Helena, and you'll interview everyone who had contact with the Pritchards in the months before Sarah's death. Is that clear? Porter looked like he wanted to argue, but thought better of it. Yes, Your Honor. Good. I'll be staying in Stillwater until this matter is resolved. Morrison's gaze shifted to Ruth. Mrs. Vaughn, you and your husband will need to remain available for questioning as well. I trust that won't be a problem? No problem at all, Your Honor, Ruth said, and she couldn't keep the relief out of her voice. Thank you. Morrison nodded and walked away, already barking orders at Porter about securing the Pritchard property for investigation. Ruth stood there in the middle of Main Street, hardly believing what had just happened. She'd come back expecting resistance, expecting to fight for every inch of ground. Instead, she'd gotten a judge, an actual territorial judge who was willing to listen. Well, Elias said quietly, his hand finding hers. That went better than expected. Ruth laughed, the sound almost hysterical. Yeah, it did. But the relief was short-lived. Because Thomas Pritchard was pushing through the crowd, his face purple with rage, and he was heading straight for Ruth. You! He snarled, jabbing a finger at her chest. You killed my wife, and now you're trying to blame me? You're going to pay for this, you hear me? I'm going to make sure... He didn't get to finish. Elias moved between them so fast Ruth barely saw it, his hand catching Thomas's wrist and twisting it behind his back hard enough to make the bigger man gasp. Touch my wife again, Elias said, his voice deadly calm, and they'll be investigating your death next. We clear? Thomas struggled, but Elias had leverage and training from years of surviving alone in the mountains. He held Thomas easily, waiting for an answer. Clear, Thomas finally spat. Elias released him with a shove that sent Thomas stumbling. Good. Now get out of our sight before I change my mind about being civilized. Thomas looked like he wanted to fight, wanted to swing at Elias or Ruth or both of them, but he was smart enough to recognize that he'd lost this round. He turned and stalked away, shoving through the crowd, and Ruth heard him muttering threats under his breath. That's going to be a problem, Ruth said quietly. Let it be a problem, Elias replied. We've got the law on our side now, and if he tries anything, I'll handle it. Ruth wanted to argue that violence wasn't the answer, but looking at Thomas's retreating back, she wasn't sure that was true anymore. Some problems couldn't be solved with words or documentation. Some problems required force. She just hoped it wouldn't come to that. The investigation took 3 weeks. 3 weeks of Ruth and Elias staying in Stillwater, renting a room above the general store, enduring the stares and whispers of people who still thought Ruth was a murderer. 3 weeks of watching Sheriff Porter and the physician from Helena, a stern older man named Dr. Patterson, interview witnesses, examine evidence, and slowly piece together the truth of what had happened to Sarah Pritchard. Ruth wasn't allowed to be present for most of it. Judge Morrison said it would be inappropriate, given her personal involvement. So she waited, day after day, helping Mrs. Hadley at the general store to earn their keep, trying not to think about what they might be finding. Elias spent most of his time watching Thomas, following him, observing him, making sure he didn't run or try to intimidate witnesses. It wasn't subtle. Elias wasn't trying to be subtle, and Thomas hated it, kept threatening to file complaints about harassment. But Judge Morrison had given Elias tacit permission to keep an eye on the suspect, so there wasn't much Thomas could do except seethe. On the 18th day, Dr. Patterson called Ruth into his temporary office in the sheriff's station. She went alone. Elias offered to come, but Ruth wanted to face this by herself. Patterson was sitting behind a desk covered in papers, his expression grave. "Mrs. Vaughn, thank you for coming. Did you find something?" Ruth's heart was pounding so hard she felt dizzy. "We found everything." Patterson pulled out a report, slid it across the desk. The exhumation showed extensive skeletal damage consistent with repeated blunt force trauma. 3 broken ribs, all in various stages of healing. A fractured orbital bone from approximately 6 months before death. Hairline fractures in both wrists. And significant internal scarring in the abdominal cavity that suggests previous injuries had healed badly. Ruth felt her throat close up. "So I was right. She was being hurt." "You were absolutely right. And more than that, the internal damage you described in your notes matches what we found. Your observations were accurate and detailed. If anyone had bothered to listen to you 6 months ago, Sarah Pritchard's death would have been investigated properly from the start. What happens now? Now we arrest Thomas Pritchard for murder, or manslaughter, depending on how the territorial prosecutor wants to charge it. Either way, he's going to face trial. Patterson leaned back in his chair. "I'm also recommending formal investigations into Reverend Thorne, Mayor Cord, and Dr. Hayes for obstruction of justice and conspiracy to violate your civil rights. What they did to you, forcing you into marriage, threatening you with illegal commitment, that's a crime. They need to answer for it." Ruth could barely breathe. She'd hoped for vindication, for proof that she'd been right about Sarah. But this was more than she'd dared to imagine. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you so much. Don't thank me. Thank yourself for having the courage to come back and fight." Patterson stood and extended his hand. "You're a hell of a physician, Mrs. Vaughn. This territory needs more people like you." Ruth shook his hand, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time in 6 months, she felt like she could breathe freely. The trial happened in June, in the territorial courthouse in Helena. Ruth and Elias made the trip, along with half of Stillwater, some to support Thomas, most to witness what everyone was already calling the trial of the decade. Ruth testified for 3 hours, describing everything she'd observed the night Sarah died. Dr. Patterson testified about the exhumation findings. Other women came forward, quietly, nervously, to talk about seeing Sarah with bruises, hearing arguments from the Pritchard cabin, suspecting abuse but being too afraid to report it. Thomas's defense tried to argue that the injuries could have come from falls, from accidents, from anything except deliberate violence. But the sheer volume of damage, the pattern of it, the fact that Sarah had never sought medical treatment for any of these supposed accidents, it all added up to something undeniable. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty of manslaughter, 20 years hard labor. Ruth watched them lead Thomas away in chains and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since the day Sarah died. It wasn't satisfaction, exactly. Sarah was still dead. Her baby was still motherless. 20 years wouldn't bring her back. But it was justice. It was acknowledgement that Sarah's life had mattered, that her death had meant something, that the people who'd tried to cover it up had failed. After the verdict, Judge Morrison pulled Ruth aside. "I've been reviewing your case, Mrs. Vaughn, the circumstances of your forced marriage, your exile from Stillwater. I'm prepared to annul the marriage if you want, free you from any obligation to Mr. Vaughn." Ruth looked across the courthouse to where Elias was waiting, his eyes on her, patient and calm and steady. She thought about the past 6 months, the mountain, the cabin, the slow building of trust and partnership, and something deeper than either of them had planned for. "No," Ruth said. "Thank you, Your Honor, but no. I choose to stay married. I choose him." Morrison smiled. "I thought you might say that. In that case, I'm also prepared to write you a letter of recommendation. There's a need for qualified medical professionals throughout the territory, and your testimony demonstrated a level of skill and dedication that's rare. If you wanted to pursue formal training, I could help arrange it." Ruth's breath caught. "Formal training? You mean medical school?" "There are a few institutions back east that accept women now. It's not easy, and you'd face resistance, but if anyone could do it, I think it's you." Morrison handed her a card with an address in Boston. "Think about it. The world is changing, Mrs. Vaughn. Might as well change with it. Ruth took the card with shaking hands, hardly believing what she was hearing. Medical school, real training, the chance to become not just a midwife, but a doctor. She found Elias outside the courthouse, showed him the card, explained what Judge Morrison had offered. Boston, Elias said slowly. That's far. Very far. Years of school. It would mean leaving the mountain, leaving Montana maybe. Ruth held her breath, waiting for his reaction. Elias looked at the card, then at Ruth, then back at the card. Finally, he smiled. Then I guess we're moving to Boston. You do that? Leave everything you know? Ruth. Elias took her face in his hands. You are everything I know now. Where you go, I go. Mountain or city, Montana or Massachusetts. Doesn't matter. We're together. Ruth kissed him right there on the courthouse steps, not caring who saw, not caring about propriety or expectations or anything except the feeling of Elias's arms around her and the future stretching out ahead of them, wide and bright and full of possibility. They stayed in Montana long enough to sell the cabin and their supplies, to say goodbye to the mountain that had been their refuge and their salvation. Then they boarded a train east, heading toward a future neither of them had planned, but both of them were ready to build together. Boston in 1885 was nothing like Montana. The city swallowed Ruth and Elias whole the moment they stepped off the train, noise and smoke and bodies everywhere. Buildings stacked so close together they blocked out the sky. Ruth stood on the platform with her bag in one hand and Elias's arm in the other, trying not to let the panic show on her face. It's loud, Elias said, his voice tight. His hand went to his ear, the one that could hear now, like he wanted to block out the chaos. I didn't think it would be this loud. We can leave, Ruth said immediately. We can get back on the train, go somewhere else. Somewhere quieter. Elias looked down at her, and despite the strain in his expression, he smiled. No, you came to Boston to go to medical school. We're staying. They found a boarding house in the North End, a narrow building squeezed between a bakery and a cobbler's shop. The room was tiny, barely big enough for a bed and a washstand, and it cost more per week than their cabin had cost per month. But it was clean, and the landlady, a sharp-eyed Irish woman named Mrs. O'Brien, didn't ask too many questions when Elias handed over the first month's rent in cash. Medical school, is it? Mrs. O'Brien asked Ruth, her tone suggesting this was the most ridiculous thing she'd heard all week. And how's a woman going to manage that then? Same way anyone manages anything, Ruth said evenly, by working hard and refusing to quit. Mrs. O'Brien snorted but didn't argue. Classes start in September. You've got 2 months to prepare. I'd spend them learning to speak proper if I were you. That frontier accent won't do you any favors with the professors. Ruth bristled, but Elias squeezed her hand before she could respond. Thank you for the advice, he said, his voice carefully polite. We appreciate it. After Mrs. O'Brien left, Ruth turned to Elias. My accent is fine. It's distinctive, Elias said diplomatically. But she's right. If you want them to take you seriously, you need to sound like you belong here. I don't belong here. I belong on a mountain in Montana with you. Then we'll go back after you finish school. But first, you're going to become a doctor. Elias pulled her close, kissed her forehead. And I'm going to do whatever it takes to help you get there. The next 2 months were brutal. Ruth spent her days at the public library, reading everything she could find about anatomy, physiology, chemistry, and surgical techniques. Her nights were spent practicing sutures on pieces of leather Elias bought from a tanner, memorizing Latin terminology, writing and rewriting her application letter to the Boston Female Medical College until every word was perfect. Elias found work at the docks, loading cargo. It was hard labor, the kind that left him exhausted and aching by the end of each day, but it paid better than anything else he was qualified for. He came home smelling of sweat and salt water, his hands rough and blistered, and refused to complain even once. How was it? Ruth would ask each evening. Fine, Elias would say, which Ruth knew meant terrible, but I'm not going to worry you about it. They had exactly 3 conversations that mattered during those 2 months. The first happened in late July, when Ruth came back to their room to find Elias sitting on the bed with his head in his hands. She'd never seen him like this, defeated, broken down in a way the mountain had never managed. What happened? Ruth set down her books and crossed to him. Are you hurt? No. Yes. I don't know. Elias's voice was muffled. I can't do this, Ruth. The noise, the crowds, the constant movement. It's too much. I feel like I'm drowning. Ruth's heart cracked. She'd been so focused on her own preparation that she hadn't stopped to think about what this city was doing to Elias. He'd spent 18 years in silence, then another year in the quiet of the mountains. Boston had to feel like being trapped in a nightmare. We can leave, Ruth said again. Forget medical school. We'll go back west, find somewhere else to live. Somewhere quiet. No. Elias lifted his head, and his eyes were red but determined. No. You're not giving this up because I'm struggling. I just need to adjust. I'll figure it out. Elias, I'll figure it out, he repeated more firmly. This is important to you. That makes it important to me. I'm not the reason you fail. Ruth wanted to argue that he could never be the reason she failed, that his well-being mattered more than any degree. But she saw the stubborn set of his jaw, and knew arguing would only hurt him more. Okay, she said quietly. But if it gets to be too much, you tell me. Promise? I promise. The second conversation happened in mid-August when Ruth's acceptance letter arrived. She'd been checking the mail obsessively for weeks, and when she saw the envelope with the Boston Female Medical College letterhead, her hand shook so badly she could barely open it. Elias stood beside her, reading over her shoulder as Ruth scanned the page. It took her 3 tries to actually absorb the words because her brain kept stuttering over them, refusing to believe what they said. You're in, Elias said, his voice filled with something that sounded like awe. Ruth, you're in. They accepted me. Ruth read the letter again, checking for conditions or caveats. Full enrollment, starting September 15th. They actually accepted me. Elias picked her up and spun her around, right there in the narrow boarding house hallway, and Ruth laughed until her sides hurt. When he set her down, his eyes were shining. I'm so proud of you, he said. You know that, right? I'm so damn proud. Ruth kissed him, tasting salt and happiness. I couldn't have done this without you. Yes, you could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to. The third conversation was the hardest. It happened 3 days before classes started, when Ruth realized she was pregnant. She'd suspected for a week, but hadn't wanted to believe it. Her courses had always been irregular, especially under stress, so missing one didn't necessarily mean anything. But missing 2, combined with the nausea that hit her every morning and the exhaustion that felt different from just being tired, Ruth knew what those signs meant. She told Elias that evening after he came home from the docks. Just said it straight out. No preamble, because there was no good way to deliver news that complicated. I'm pregnant. Elias froze halfway through taking off his boots. You're sure? As sure as I can be without a proper examination. All the symptoms match. Ruth sat on the bed, her hands twisted together. I don't know how it happened. I mean, I know how, but I was being careful. Ruth. Elias crossed to her, knelt in front of her. It's okay. It's not okay. I start medical school in 3 days. Pregnant women don't go to medical school. They'll expel me the second they find out. Then we don't tell them. Ruth laughed, the sound slightly hysterical. I can't hide a pregnancy for 9 months, Elias. Eventually people notice. So we tell them you're sick, that you need to take a semester off. You have the baby, recover, come back. Elias's hands were steady on her knees. Or you defer enrollment for a year. Or we find another school that's more understanding. Or we figure out something else entirely. But we don't give up. What if I can't do both? What if I can't be a doctor and a mother? Then you choose. Elias's voice was firm. And whatever you choose, I'll support it. But don't choose based on what you think you should do. Choose based on what you want. Ruth looked at him, at this man who'd upended his entire life to support her dreams, who worked himself to exhaustion every day so she could go to school, who never once complained about how hard it was. And she realized that she'd been thinking about this all wrong. This wasn't medical school versus motherhood. It was figuring out how to build a life that included everything she wanted, even if it looked different from what she'd planned. "I want both," Ruth said quietly. "I want to be a doctor, and I want this baby. I want our family. I just don't know how to make it work." "Neither do I," Elias admitted. "But we'll figure it out, together." So Ruth started medical school 3 months pregnant and terrified. She wore loose dresses, claimed she'd always been sturdy-built when anyone commented on her figure, and threw herself into her studies with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. The work was harder than anything she'd ever done, harder than surviving Montana winters, harder than delivering babies in frontier cabins, harder than facing down Stillwater's judgment. The professors were dismissive at best and openly hostile at worst. Her classmates, all 12 of them, women who'd fought just as hard to be there, were competitive in ways that felt vicious. But Ruth kept going. She memorized anatomy until she could draw every bone and muscle from memory. She practiced surgical techniques on cadavers until her hands stopped shaking. She studied pharmacology and pathology and obstetrics, absorbing everything like she was starving for it. Which she was. This was what she'd wanted for as long as she could remember. Real knowledge, proper training, the chance to be more than just a frontier midwife making do with scraps of information. Her pregnancy became impossible to hide around month 5. Ruth had managed to conceal it with careful positioning and strategic clothing, but one of her professors, Dr. Margaret Sterling, the only female faculty member, pulled her aside after a particularly grueling anatomy practical. "Mrs. Vaughn," Dr. Sterling said, her voice carefully neutral, "I need to speak with you in my office." Ruth followed, her stomach churning with more than morning sickness. This was it. They were going to expel her. Dr. Sterling closed the door and gestured for Ruth to sit. "How far along are you?" "No point lying now." "Almost 6 months." "And you plan to tell the administration when exactly?" "Never, if I could help it." Ruth met Dr. Sterling's eyes. "I know the rules. I know pregnant women aren't supposed to attend medical school. But I'm here, and I'm doing the work, and I'm not giving up my seat just because I'm having a baby." Dr. Sterling was quiet for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. "Good. I was hoping you'd say something like that." Ruth blinked. "I'm sorry?" "I was pregnant during my final year of medical school, 20 years ago, when it was even more scandalous than it is now." Dr. Sterling leaned back in her chair. "I wore corsets that made me faint. I studied through false labor pains, and I delivered my daughter 2 weeks before my final examinations. It was hell, but I finished." "Ipoba sa shamat." "You're not going to report me?" "Report you for what? Being competent while pregnant?" Dr. Sterling shook her head. "You're one of the top students in your class, Mrs. Vaughn. Your work is exceptional. I'm not going to penalize you for biology." Ruth felt tears prick her eyes. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. You're going to need to take a leave of absence for the birth and recovery. The administration won't allow you to attend classes in your 3rd trimester or immediately postpartum. You'll miss at least 1 semester, possibly 2. I'll make it up. I'll study on my own, take extra courses, whatever it takes." "I know you will." Dr. Sterling pulled out a stack of papers. "Here, reading lists for the courses you'll miss, study guides, practice exams. If you work through these while you're out, you should be able to test back into the program without losing too much time." Ruth took the papers with shaking hands. "Why are you helping me?" "Because 20 years ago, no one helped me, and I nearly died trying to do it all alone." Dr. Sterling's expression softened. "Medicine needs women like us, Mrs. Vaughn. Women who refuse to choose between professional excellence and personal life. Women who prove it's possible to be both brilliant and human." Ruth left Dr. Sterling's office with renewed determination and a study plan that would have killed a lesser person. She threw herself into the work even harder, racing against the clock of her own body. Her daughter was born in March, in the same boarding house room where Ruth and Elias had spent the past year struggling and surviving and building something that felt like a real life. Mrs. O'Brien served as midwife. Turned out she'd delivered half the babies in the North End, and Elias held Ruth's hand through 14 hours of labor that Ruth would later describe as the worst and best experience of her life. They named her Sarah. Sarah Margaret Vaughn, after the woman whose death had started everything and the professor who'd made it possible to continue. Ruth took 6 weeks to recover. 6 weeks of sleepless nights and painful nursing and learning to be a mother while also trying to maintain her studies. It was brutal. There were days when Ruth cried from exhaustion, days when she was sure she couldn't do it, days when she wanted to give up. But Elias was there, always there. He learned to change diapers and mix formula for when Ruth was too tired to nurse. He walked Sarah for hours when she wouldn't stop crying. His deaf ear actually an advantage because the screaming didn't bother him as much. He brought Ruth books from the library and coffee from the shop downstairs and reminded her, again and again, that she was doing something extraordinary. "You're going to make it," he'd say, rocking Sarah while Ruth studied at the washstand that doubled as her desk. "You're going to finish school and become a doctor and change everything." "How do you know?" Ruth would ask, too tired to believe it herself. "Because I know you, and you don't know how to quit." Ruth went back to school when Sarah was 2 months old. It was agony leaving her daughter with Mrs. O'Brien each morning, agony trying to focus on lectures when her breasts ached with milk, agony studying late into the night when all she wanted was to sleep. But she did it. She caught up on the coursework she'd missed. She took her exams. She excelled. By her 3rd year, Ruth had developed a reputation. She was the woman who'd come to Boston from Montana, who'd gotten pregnant and had a baby, and somehow still managed to be at the top of her class. Students whispered about her. Professors used her as an example, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, depending on their views about women in medicine. Ruth didn't care what they said. She just kept working. Her thesis focused on childbirth trauma and domestic violence. Sarah Pritchard's death had never left her, and Ruth was determined to make sure other women didn't suffer the same fate. She documented patterns of injury, developed protocols for identifying abuse, created treatment plans that prioritized the patient's safety alongside their medical care. Dr. Sterling called it groundbreaking. The male professors called it emotional and unscientific. Ruth called it necessary and refused to change a single word. She graduated in 1889, 4 years after starting, with honors and a medical degree that had cost her everything and given her more than she'd ever imagined. The ceremony was held in a stuffy auditorium filled with families and faculty. Ruth walked across the stage in her borrowed academic robes, accepted her diploma from the dean who'd tried to expel her twice, and looked out into the audience to find Elias holding 3-year-old Sarah on his shoulders, both of them cheering loud enough to be heard over everyone else. That night, in their boarding house room that had somehow become home, Elias opened a bottle of whiskey they'd been saving for this moment. "To Dr. Ruth Vaughn," he said, pouring 2 glasses, "the most stubborn, brilliant, impossible woman I've ever met." "I'm impossible?" Ruth laughed, accepting her glass. "You moved to Boston. You worked yourself half to death so I could go to school. You became a father while living in a city you hate. If anyone's impossible, it's you." "We're both impossible. That's why it works." Elias clinked his glass against hers. "What happens now?" Ruth had been thinking about that question for months. They could stay in Boston. There were opportunities here, hospitals that might hire a female physician, patients who needed care. But Boston had never felt right. It was too loud, too crowded, too far from everything that mattered. "I want to go back west," Ruth said. "Not to Stillwater. Somewhere else. Somewhere that needs doctors and doesn't care whether they're men or women as long as they can do the work." Elias's relief was visible. "Thank God. I was afraid you'd want to stay here. You would have stayed if I'd wanted to." "Of course, but I'd much rather go home." He paused. "Where exactly are we going?" Ruth pulled out a letter she'd received 2 weeks earlier. It was from Judge Morrison, who'd kept in touch over the years, checking on her progress and offering advice. His latest letter contained an opportunity. "There's a valley in Montana, about 100 miles north of Stillwater. Small town, maybe 200 people, surrounded by ranches and farms. They've been trying to recruit a doctor for years, but no one wants to go that far from civilization." Ruth handed the letter to Elias. "Morrison says they'd welcome a female physician, especially one with training in obstetrics and rural medicine. He's already spoken to the town council. They're willing to provide a building for a clinic and housing for our family. Accusations. Elias read the letter, his expression thoughtful. It's remote, isolated, hard living. Just like the mountain. Yeah, say, Elias smiled. Just like the mountain. When do we leave? They packed up their lives in Boston within a month. Ruth said goodbye to Dr. Sterling, who hugged her and made her promise to write. She said goodbye to Mrs. O'Brien, who cried and claimed she'd known from the start that Ruth would make something of herself. She said goodbye to the city that had given her everything she'd needed and nothing she'd wanted. Then Ruth, Elias, and Sarah boarded a train heading west, back to Montana, back to mountains and sky, and the kind of silence that felt like breathing. The town was called Clearwater Valley, and it was exactly as remote and beautiful as Ruth had hoped. Mountains on three sides, a river cutting through the middle, buildings scattered along a single main street. The clinic they'd been promised was small but solid. 2 rooms, good light, a wood stove for heat. Ruth set up her practice the way she'd always dreamed. Clean instruments, well-organized supplies, medical texts on shelves where anyone could read them. She put out a sign. Dr. Ruth Vaughn, physician and surgeon. Office hours daily, fees negotiable. No one turned away. The first patients came slowly, skeptically. A rancher with a badly set broken arm. A woman with pneumonia. A child with a fever that wouldn't break. Ruth treated them all with the same care and competence she'd learned in Boston, and word spread. Within 6 months, Ruth's practice was thriving. She delivered babies, set bones, performed minor surgeries, treated everything from coughs to compound fractures. She made house calls that took her miles into the countryside, riding the same trails Elias had once used for hunting. Elias built a veterinary practice alongside Ruth's clinic. Turned out all those years surviving in the wilderness had taught him more about animal medicine than most trained veterinarians knew. Ranchers brought him horses with colic, cattle with infections, dogs with broken legs. He treated them with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. They built a house on the edge of town, bigger than the cabin, but with the same solid construction. Sarah grew up running between the clinic and the barn where Elias worked, learning medicine from her mother and animal husbandry from her father. But Ruth's work extended beyond just treating patients. She started noticing patterns: women who came in with injuries that didn't match their stories, children who flinched away from certain adults, families where something was clearly wrong, but no one would speak openly about it. So Ruth created something that didn't officially exist: a network, a quiet system where women who needed help could find it, where someone fleeing an abusive husband could stay in the back room of the clinic until arrangements were made, where children could be removed from dangerous situations without waiting for authorities who might never come. It was illegal, probably, definitely outside her authority as a physician. But Ruth had learned in Stillwater that sometimes the law failed people and someone had to fill the gap. Elias helped without question. He'd take families to the next town over, help them disappear, make sure they had money and resources to start fresh somewhere else. He never asked for thanks, never kept records, never told anyone except Ruth. It was dangerous work. They had close calls, husbands showing up with guns, demanding their wives back, authority figures asking questions about missing people, threats from men who didn't appreciate a woman interfering in family matters. But Ruth and Elias had survived worse. They'd faced down Stillwater's judgment, Boston's skepticism, poverty and isolation, and every obstacle the world could throw at them. A few angry men didn't scare them anymore. Years passed. Sarah grew into a fierce, curious teenager who declared she wanted to be a doctor like her mother. 2 more children followed, a son they named William after Judge Morrison, and another daughter they called Margaret after Dr. Sterling. The clinic expanded. Elias's veterinary practice grew. The house filled with noise and life, and the kind of chaos that came from building something real. Ruth was 38 years old when she got a letter from Stillwater. It was from a woman named Emma Pritchard, Thomas's sister, who'd married and moved away years ago, but had just returned to settle her brother's estate. Thomas had died in prison. Infection, the letter said. Fitting, Ruth thought, given how many infections he'd probably caused through violence. But that wasn't why Emma was writing. She'd found something while going through Thomas's belongings. Letters, a journal. Evidence that proved Thomas had known exactly what he was doing to Sarah, had documented his own abuse with the kind of casual cruelty that made Ruth sick to read. Emma wanted Ruth to have it, wanted someone to know the truth, to keep it safe, to make sure Sarah Pritchard's death was never forgotten or dismissed. Ruth read through these documents with tears streaming down her face. She saw Sarah's suffering laid out in Thomas's own handwriting, saw every moment of pain he'd inflicted, saw proof of everything she'd suspected but could never prove in time. "You were right," Elias said quietly, reading over her shoulder. "About all of it." "I know, I always knew." Ruth set the papers down carefully. "But now everyone else knows too." She donated the documents to the Montana Historical Society with a request that they be made public. She wanted Sarah's story told, wanted other women to see what abuse looked like, wanted the world to understand that sometimes the real criminals were the ones everyone trusted most. The documents created a scandal. Newspapers picked up the story. Reverend Thorne was forced to resign from his church. Dr. Hayes lost his medical license. Mayor Cord was voted out of office. Stillwater tried to pretend it had always supported Ruth, had always believed her story. Ruth let them pretend. She had no interest in revenge anymore. She had more important things to focus on. On a warm summer evening in 1897, Ruth sat on her porch watching the sun set over the mountains. She was 42 years old. Her hair was starting to gray. Her hands had the permanent calluses of someone who worked constantly. She was tired in ways she'd never been tired on the mountain, but it was a good tired, an earned tired. Elias came out and sat beside her, their shoulders touching. 13 years of marriage, and he still made her heart beat faster. "Sarah got accepted," he said, holding up a letter. "To the medical college. Full scholarship." Ruth felt pride bloom in her chest. Her daughter. Following in her footsteps. But doing it easier, because Ruth had broken the trail first. "She's going to be better than me," Ruth said. "Impossible, but she'll be great anyway." Elias took Ruth's hand. "You did that. You showed her it was possible." "We did that," Ruth corrected. "All of this, the clinic, the practice, our family, everything we built. We did it together." Elias raised her hand to his lips, kissed her scarred knuckles. "Best decision I ever made. Saying yes when you showed up at my cabin. Best decision I ever made was not running away when things got hard. You never run from hard things. I learned that from you." Ruth leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady presence that had anchored her through everything. "I love you. You know that, right?" "I know. I love you too." They sat together as the sun disappeared behind the peaks, painting the sky orange and pink and purple. Inside the house, their children were arguing about something, probably chores. They were always arguing about chores. In town, patients would be waiting for tomorrow's office hours. The world kept turning, kept demanding, kept pushing. But here, now, Ruth felt something she'd never expected to feel again after leaving Stillwater. She felt home. Not because of the place, though she loved these mountains, this valley, this life they'd carved out of stubborn determination and hard work, but because of the man beside her, the family they'd built, the work they did that mattered. Ruth had been called a killer, a witch, a woman who didn't know her place. She'd been exiled, forced into marriage, pushed to the absolute edge of what a person could endure. And she'd survived it all. More than survived, she'd thrived. She'd become Dr. Ruth Vaughn, a physician who saved lives and challenged systems and refused to accept that the world's cruelty was unchangeable. She'd proven that one woman, armed with knowledge and courage and the support of one good person who believed in her, could change everything. Not overnight, not easily, not without cost. But change was possible. Progress was possible. Justice was possible. You just had to be stubborn enough to keep fighting for it. Ruth smiled, squeezed Elias's hand, and watched the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new patients, new problems to solve. But tonight, she had this: peace, love, and the knowledge that everything she'd endured had been worth it. Because she hadn't just survived, she'd won. And that, Ruth thought, was the best revenge of all. The world had tried to break Ruth Calder, had tried to silence her, diminish her, erase her from existence. Instead, she'd become Dr. Ruth Vaughn, and she'd change the world anyway.